The hallways of the LAPD's Van Nuys station were bustling with the usual morning energy in June 2009. Detectives sipped coffee and swapped case notes, unaware that a tactical team was moving into position within their own walls. At the center of the storm was Stephanie Lazarus, a highly respected veteran and a specialist in high-end art theft. She was a woman who had spent over 2 decades climbing the ranks, earning the trust of her peers while hiding a secret that would shatter the department's reputation. As she was led away in handcuffs, the shock wasn't just that a detective had been arrested. It was the realization that the killer they had been hunting since 1986 had been sitting in the desk right next to them. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. In the mid-1980s, Sherry Rasmussen was the quintessential picture of success and vitality in Los Angeles. At 29 years old, she had already established herself as a powerhouse in the medical field, serving as the director of nursing at the Adventist Medical Center in Glendale. To those who knew her, Sherry was more than just a title. She was a woman of immense intelligence and boundless empathy who had climbed the professional ladder with a grace that left many in awe. She was tall, blonde, and possessed a radiant energy that seemed to light up every room she entered, a stark contrast to the gritty reality of the city she served. Her life was a meticulously woven tapestry of ambition and kindness, and by 1985, she believed she had finally found the partner who would share in her bright future. John Retton was a handsome, athletic engineer who seemed to be Sherry's perfect match. When they met, the connection was almost instantaneous. They were both young professionals with their lives ahead of them, sharing a love for the outdoors and a drive for success. To Sherry, John was the grounding force she needed, a man who appreciated her strength and independence. Their romance was the kind that friends envied, filled with weekend trips and quiet evenings planning a life together. By the time they decided to marry in November 1985, their world seemed impenetrable. They purchased a beautiful townhouse in Van Nuys, a quiet suburb where they hoped to build a family. It was a time of pure optimism, the kind of era where the biggest worry was choosing the right furniture or balancing demanding careers. However, beneath the surface of this idyllic union, there was a history John hadn't fully reconciled, a lingering shadow from his past named Stephanie Lazarus. John and Stephanie had met years earlier during their time at Oklahoma State University. They had a casual, on-and-off relationship that spanned several years, but for John, it was never a serious commitment. He viewed Stephanie as a close friend with whom he occasionally shared more, but he never intended for her to be his wife. Stephanie, however, viewed the situation through a much more obsessive lens. To her, John wasn't just a former flame. He was the one who got away, the man she believed was rightfully hers. When John told Stephanie that he was engaged to Sherry, the news didn't just hurt her, it ignited a pathological jealousy that would simmer for months. Stephanie, who was then a young patrol officer with the LAPD, was not a woman who handled rejection with dignity. She was competitive, driven, and possessed a rigid sense of ownership over the people in her life. While John moved forward with wedding plans, Stephanie remained trapped in a cycle of resentment. She reached out to him repeatedly, expressing her heartbreak and even inviting him to her apartment to talk about his decision. John, perhaps out of a misplaced sense of loyalty to an old friend or a naive belief that she just needed closure, stayed in contact with her longer than he should have. Sherry, with her sharp intuition, sensed the intrusion immediately. She was a woman who valued honesty and directness, and the presence of this old friend in John's life felt like a jagged edge in their relationship. There were uncomfortable encounters, times when Stephanie would show up unannounced, using her status as a police officer to exert a subtle, chilling pressure. On one occasion, Stephanie appeared at the hospital where Sherry worked, dressed in her full LAPD uniform. She wasn't there for a medical reason. She was there to mark her territory. She made it clear to Sherry that she had a long history with John and that she wasn't going anywhere. For Sherry, this was no longer just a crazy ex story. It was a targeted campaign of harassment from someone who carried a badge and a gun. Sherry pleaded with John to handle the situation, expressing her growing fear that Stephanie was unstable. She told her father, Nels Rasmussen, about the blonde policewoman who wouldn't leave them alone. Nels, a man who adored his daughter, felt a chill when Sherry described the interactions. He urged his daughter to be careful, but in the optimistic haze of a new marriage, it was hard to imagine that a professional peer, a guardian of the law, could be a legitimate physical threat. They believed that once the wedding was over and their life in Van Nuys truly began, the shadow of Stephanie Lazarus would finally dissipate. They couldn't have known that for Stephanie, the marriage wasn't the end of the story. It was the ultimate provocation. As Sherry settled into her new home, decorating the rooms and excelling in her career, she was unknowingly being watched by a woman who viewed her happiness as a personal theft. The collision between Sherry's bright, promising world and Stephanie's dark, obsessive one was no longer a matter of if, but when. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the winter of 1986, one must look closely at the woman who walked the thin blue line by day and nurtured a toxic obsession by night. Stephanie Lazarus was born in 1960 into a world that demanded discipline and achievement. By the time she joined the Los Angeles Police Department in the early 80s, she was a woman defined by her tenacity and a desperate need to belong to an elite tier of society. She was athletic, competitive, and possessed a blunt, almost clinical way of interacting with the world, traits that made her an effective officer, but often left her personal relationships strained and one-sided. The central pillar of Stephanie's emotional world was John Ruetten. They had met at Oklahoma State University, where they both lived in the same dorm. To John, Stephanie was a comfortable companion, a buddy, with whom he shared a physical connection and a mutual love for sports. To Stephanie, however, John was the ultimate prize. He represented the kind of stable, successful, middle-class life she craved. She didn't just love him, she felt a sense of ownership over him. Their relationship was a long-distance, intermittent affair that followed them back to Southern California after graduation. While John was moving on, building his career as an engineer and seeking a partner who challenged and inspired him, Stephanie was still keeping score. She kept every letter he wrote, every memento of their time together, meticulously filing them away like evidence in a case she refused to close. The psychological shift in Stephanie occurred when John introduced her to Sherry Rasmussen. For a woman as competitive as Stephanie, Sherry wasn't just a girlfriend. She was an adversary who had won the life Stephanie believed was hers by right. Sherry was everything Stephanie was not. She was high-ranking in the medical world, she was conventionally beautiful, and she possessed a natural warmth that drew people in effortlessly. When John and Sherry announced their engagement in 1985, Stephanie's internal world began to fracture. She wrote in her journal about her profound despair and sadness. But these emotions quickly curdled into something far more dangerous, a focused, predatory resentment. Stephanie did not retreat. Instead, she used her badge as a tool of intimidation. On multiple occasions, she appeared at the couple's home and at Sherry's workplace, often under the guise of checking in on John. These weren't the actions of a heartbroken ex-lover. They were the calculated maneuvers of a stalker who understood the power of her uniform. She knew that as an LAPD officer, she occupied a position of inherent trust and authority. If Sherry complained, who would the police believe? Their fellow officer or a jealous wife? Stephanie was essentially gaslighting the couple, forcing her presence into their most private moments. In the months leading up to the murder, Stephanie's behavior became increasingly erratic. She once showed up at their townhouse while John was away, and Sherry was home alone. She claimed she needed to pick up some old belongings, but the items she took, a set of old skis, were merely an excuse to stand in Sherry's living room, to breathe the same air, and to let Sherry know that she could bypass any lock. Sherry was terrified. She told her friends and family that she felt like she was being hunted. She specifically told John that Stephanie was crazy and begged him to make her stay away. But John, perhaps trapped in the nice guy trope, continued to believe he could manage Stephanie's emotions through occasional conversation, not realizing he was feeding a fire that was already out of control. Stephanie's obsession was further fueled by her professional life. As she moved through the ranks of the LAPD, she was learning exactly how the system worked. She knew how crime scenes were processed, how evidence was gathered, and more importantly, how investigations could be steered or stalled. She was a student of the blue wall of silence, the unspoken rule that officers protect their own. She understood that if she were to commit a crime, her best shield would be the very department she served. The internal pressure reached a boiling point in early 1986. John and Sherry had been married for only 3 months. They were happy, they were successful, and they were planning a future that did not include Stephanie. For Stephanie, this was the ultimate rejection. She began to see Sherry not just as a rival, but as a parasite that had attached itself to the life Stephanie deserved. She began to plan. She didn't want John back as much as she wanted Sherry gone. She needed to erase the error that John had made in choosing someone else. In late January 1986, Stephanie reported her personal .38 caliber Smith & Wesson snub-nosed revolver stolen from her car while she was at a shopping mall. It was a classic police report move, creating a paper trail for a missing weapon that would later be used in a homicide. By reporting it stolen, she provided herself with an alibi for the weapon's disappearance. She was already thinking like a detective, even as she prepared to become a killer. She was cold, methodical, and utterly convinced of her own superiority. She believed she could outsmart the science, outsmart her colleagues, and outsmart the Rasmussens. She was the shadow in the hallway, the officer on the beat, and the jilted lover with a badge, all converging into a single, lethal intent. As February 24th approached, Stephanie wasn't just an officer doing her duty, she was a woman preparing for a confrontation she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. She knew John's schedule. She knew Sherry would be home. She knew exactly which door to knock on and what she would do when it opened. The tragedy of Sherry Rasmussen wasn't just that she was murdered. It was that her killer was someone who had sworn an oath to protect the very community Sherry lived in. Stephanie Lazarus was the wolf who had learned to wear the shepherd's clothes perfectly. The morning of February 24, 1986, began like any other Monday in the Van Nuys townhouse of John and Sherry Retton. John left for work early, leaving Sherry behind. She had decided to take the day off to rest, a rare luxury for a woman who spent most of her waking hours managing a hospital staff. The house was quiet. The neighborhood was still, and for a few hours, Sherry was alone in the sanctuary she and her husband had built. But outside, a different kind of mourning was unfolding. Stephanie Lazarus, a woman who knew John's schedule as well as he did, was no longer content with watching from the sidelines. She was armed, she was prepared, and she had reached a point of no return. The confrontation began not with a forced entry, but likely with a knock or a familiar face. There were no signs that the front door had been kicked in. Stephanie likely used her status or a pretext to get inside. Once the threshold was crossed, the atmosphere in the townhouse shifted from domestic peace to a frantic, primal struggle for survival. Sherry Rasmussen was not a woman who gave up easily. Despite the surprise of the attack, she fought back with every ounce of strength she possessed. The two women, one a healer, the other a protector turned predator, engaged in a violent battle that spilled across the living room floor. The evidence of this struggle was carved into the very walls of the home. Furniture was overturned, and a ceramic vase was shattered, its shards scattered like jagged glass across the carpet. Sherry was a tall, athletic woman, and she used her reach to fend off her attacker. At some point during the melee, the physical proximity became so close that Stephanie, driven by a desperate, animalistic rage, sunk her teeth into Sherry's forearm. It was a bite of such intensity that it left a deep, bruised impression, a mark of literal ownership and hatred that would, decades later, become the silent witness to the truth. As the struggle intensified, the attacker realized that physical strength alone might not finish the job. Sherry was fighting too hard. She was too resilient. Stephanie reached for her weapon, the .38 caliber snub-nosed revolver she had strategically lost just weeks prior. But the fight wasn't over. Sherry lunged for the gun, or perhaps tried to shield herself, and in the chaos, shots rang out. The sound was muffled by the walls of the townhouse, unheard by neighbors who were busy with their own morning routines. The first 2 shots struck Sherry in the torso, but she continued to move, her body fueled by pure adrenaline and the desperate will to live. The final, fatal shot was delivered at point-blank range, a cold and calculated execution. The bullet entered Sherry's chest, ending the struggle instantly. The director of nursing, the woman who had dedicated her life to saving others, lay dead on her own living room floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her life. Stephanie Lazarus didn't panic. She had been trained for this. She knew that a clean crime scene was a suspicious one. To mask her true motive, a crime of passion and obsession, she began to stage a robbery. She moved through the house with clinical precision. She pulled drawers open, scattering their contents to create a sense of hurried ransacking. She walked over to the electronic equipment, unplugging the VCR and placing it near the door, as if an intruder had intended to take it but was interrupted. She was creating a narrative that her colleagues would find easy to believe, a burglary gone wrong in a city plagued by rising crime rates. Before leaving, she took one final cold-blooded step. She walked out to the driveway and stole Sherry's silver BMW. It served two purposes. It provided a getaway vehicle that wouldn't be linked to her, and it reinforced the robbery-homicide theory. She drove away from the quiet Van Nuys street, leaving behind a shattered home and a woman who had been her only obstacle to the life she wanted. By the time John Retton returned home that evening, the scene was one of incomprehensible horror. He found his wife lying in the entryway, her body cold, the house a shambles. He called the police, the very department where Stephanie Lazarus was likely beginning her shift or filing her own reports. When the investigators arrived, they saw exactly what Stephanie wanted them to see. They saw the overturned furniture, the missing car, and the displaced electronics. They saw a tragedy, but they failed to see the signature of one of their own. The bite mark on Sherry's arm was noted by the medical examiner, but in 1986, DNA technology was in its infancy. It was viewed as a piece of physical evidence, perhaps a sign of a struggle with a particularly violent male intruder. Stephanie had banked on the limitations of science and the biases of her peers. She knew that the police would look for a stranger, a career criminal, or a drifter. They wouldn't look for a fellow officer with a broken heart and a .38 Smith & Wesson. As the sun set on Van Nuys that day, Stephanie Lazarus began the longest cover-up of her career. She had killed the woman who stole her husband, and she had done so using the very skills the city had paid her to learn. She was no longer just a detective. She was a ghost in the system, a killer hiding behind a shield, confident that the secrets of February 24th would remain buried in the evidence locker forever. She didn't realize that the bite she had left on Sherry's arm was a ticking time bomb, a piece of her own identity that Sherry would carry into the afterlife, waiting for the world to catch up to the truth. The arrival of the LAPD at the Rueton townhouse on the evening of February 24th, 1986, marked the beginning of an investigation that would be defined more by what was ignored than what was found. To the lead detectives on the scene, the narrative seemed obvious. Los Angeles was in the grip of a violent era, and a young woman murdered in a ransacked home screamed, "Burglary gone wrong." They saw the electronic equipment sitting by the door and the missing silver BMW as the calling cards of desperate criminals. Stephanie Lazarus had played her part perfectly. The staging was effective enough to convince her colleagues that the killer was a stranger. However, the robbery theory had gaping holes that a more critical eye should have spotted. While some items were displaced, many high-value objects remained untouched. More importantly, the sheer brutality of the attack, the prolonged struggle, and the point-blank execution suggested a level of personal hatred that rarely accompanies a simple theft. Yet, the investigators were locked into their initial premise. They weren't looking for a motive, they were looking for a type of person, a male intruder, likely a drifter or a local thief. While the police followed leads that went nowhere, Sherry's father, Nels Rasmussen, was beginning his own relentless pursuit of the truth. Nels was a man of deep convictions, and he knew his daughter. He knew about the blonde policewoman who had been stalking Sherry in the months before her death. Almost immediately, Nels began telling the detectives that they were looking in the wrong direction. He practically handed them the name, Stephanie Lazarus. He told them about the time she showed up at the hospital in full uniform to intimidate Sherry. He told them about her unannounced visits to the townhouse. The response from the LAPD was a masterclass in institutional dismissal. Whenever Nels brought up the policewoman girlfriend of John Rueton, he was met with a wall of skepticism. The lead detective, Lyle Mayer, reportedly told Nels that he watched too much television and that his theory was preposterous. Within the department, Stephanie was a known entity, a rising star. The idea that a fellow officer, someone they saw at the gym, someone who shared their badge, could be a cold-blooded killer was a bridge too far for the investigators of 1986. They preferred the comfort of the anonymous criminal narrative over the terrifying possibility of a traitor in their ranks. Nels Rasmussen did not back down. He was a constant presence at the station, a grieving father who refused to let his daughter's case go cold. He wrote letters to the chief of police, he demanded meetings with supervisors, and he kept meticulous notes of every interaction. But the more he pushed, the more the department pulled away. The case file began to gather dust. The silver BMW was eventually found abandoned a few miles away, but it yielded no fingerprints that matched the criminal databases of the time. The DNA from the bite mark on Sherry's arm was preserved in a glass vial, but it sat in an evidence locker, a biological relic that the 1980s didn't have the keys to unlock. Throughout this period, Stephanie Lazarus continued her life as if nothing had happened. She worked her beats, she earned commendations, and she even occasionally saw John Rutan. For John, the grief was overwhelming, and in the absence of any other suspects, he struggled to reconcile his past with Stephanie with the horror of his present. He too was a victim of the blue wall. He had been interviewed, of course, but his alibi was solid. The police never seriously investigated the woman he had once dated because they had already decided who the killer was, and it wasn't a cop. The botched robbery theory became the official truth, a convenient lie that protected the department's image and allowed a murderer to hide in plain sight. For over 20 years, the file on Sherry Rasmussen remained dormant, classified as uncleared. To the LAPD, it was a tragic statistic of a violent decade. To Nels Rasmussen, it was an open wound that refused to heal. He watched as Stephanie Lazarus was promoted to detective, then to a specialist in the prestigious art theft detail. He watched her build a career and a life, all while his daughter's life remained a frozen moment of violence that the world had chosen to forget. Nels's fight was a lonely one. He was fighting a system that was designed to protect itself. A system that viewed his persistence as a nuisance rather than a quest for justice. But his refusal to stay silent was the only thing that kept Sherry's memory from being completely erased by the bureaucracy of the LAPD. He was waiting for the world to catch up to what he already knew in his heart. He was waiting for a day when the badge wouldn't be enough to hide the bite mark. As the 80s bled into the 90s, and the 90s into the new millennium, the case of Sherry Rasmussen seemed destined to remain one of the city's great unsolved mysteries, until the science of the future finally arrived to settle the debts of the past. For nearly 2 decades, the case of Sherry Rasmussen remained a stagnant file in the LAPD's archives. To the world, Sherry was a tragic statistic of 1980s Los Angeles. To her father, Nels, she was a daughter whose killer was walking the halls of justice. By 2004, the landscape of criminal investigation had shifted fundamentally with the maturation of DNA technology. It was no longer a theoretical science but a precision tool that could pull a name out of a microscopic sample of saliva. Inside the LAPD's Scientific Investigation Division, a concerted effort began to re-examine thousands of cold cases where biological evidence had been preserved. The turning point came when Jennifer Francis, a criminalist, pulled the Rasmussen file. Among the yellowing papers and grainy photographs, she found a reference to the bite mark on Sherry's arm. In 1986, the medical examiner had taken a swab of that wound, and against all odds, that tiny glass vial had remained intact within the evidence locker for 23 years. When Francis analyzed the sample, the results shattered the botched robbery narrative that had protected the killer for a generation. The DNA profile extracted from the bite mark did not belong to a man. It was undeniably genetically female. This revelation sent a shockwave through the small group of detectives now handling the case. For 20 years, the LAPD had been searching for 2 male suspects based on the initial robbery theory. Now, the science was telling them that the primary aggressor the person who had sunk their teeth into Sherry's flesh, was a woman. Despite this breakthrough, the case stalled again. The female DNA didn't match anyone in the criminal databases. It was a profile without a name. In 2009, Detective Jim Nuttall and his partner Pete Barba took over the investigation. They didn't just look at the new DNA, they looked at the old notes. Specifically, they looked at the persistent, desperate pleas of Nels Rasmussen. The father's notes mentioned a blonde policewoman who had been obsessed with John Ruetten. When the detectives searched the LAPD personnel records from 1986, one name rose to the surface like a ghost: Stephanie Lazarus. By now, Lazarus was a high-profile detective in the art theft detail. She was a respected veteran, a peer, and a friend to many in the department. Investigating her was a political and professional minefield. If they were wrong, they would destroy a colleague's career. If they were right, they were exposing a monster within their own house. They began a covert operation, treating one of their own like a high-stakes target. They couldn't simply ask for her DNA, they had to steal it. The surveillance team followed Lazarus as she went about her mundane life in 2009. They watched her go to the gym, run errands, and pick up her daughter. The moment of truth came at a local Costco. Lazarus finished a soda and tossed the plastic cup into a trash bin. The detectives waited until she moved away, then retrieved the cup, sealing it as the most important piece of evidence in LAPD history. The laboratory comparison was a binary moment of justice. The DNA from the soda cup, the saliva of Detective Stephanie Lazarus, was an identical match to the DNA found in the bite mark on Sherry Rasmussen's arm. The science had bridged the 23-year gap. The policewoman Nels had warned them about wasn't a theory, she was a genetic certainty. The shadow that had haunted the Rasmussen family since 1986 finally had a face, a badge number, and a desk in the Van Nuys station. The cold case hadn't just awakened, it had arrived at the front door of the killer. On the morning of June 5, 2009, the trap was finally set. The LAPD faced a delicate challenge: how to arrest a high-ranking detective within a secure police facility without triggering a violent standoff. The investigators decided on a ruse, inviting Stephanie Lazarus to a room in the basement of the Parker Center under the guise of discussing a suspect in an art theft case. She arrived calm and professional, carrying herself with the practiced confidence of a veteran. She had no idea that the suspect she was there to discuss was actually herself. The interrogation, captured on video, remains one of the most chilling pieces of forensic psychology in modern history. Detectives Jim Nuttall and Dan Jaramillo began with mundane work talk before pivoting sharply to her past. When the name John Ruetten was mentioned, the atmosphere in the room visibly shifted. Lazarus, a master of interrogation herself, immediately began to employ defensive maneuvers. She feigned a foggy memory, repeating that the relationship was a million years ago and that she couldn't quite remember the details of her interactions with Sherry. As the detectives pressed further, her professional veneer began to crack. She didn't display the outrage of an innocent person wrongly accused. Instead, she exhibited the wary, calculated movements of a cornered predator. When they asked if she had ever had a physical confrontation with Sherry, her denials were hollow and punctuated by long, heavy silences. The moment they informed her that her DNA had been found at the crime scene, the game was over. She stood up, attempting to end the interview and walk out back to her desk, but she was met by a wall of fellow officers. The downfall was swift. Stephanie Lazarus was stripped of her badge and gun, the very symbols of authority she had used to mask her crime for 23 years. In 2012, her trial became a media sensation. The prosecution presented the smoking gun, the biological evidence that proved she had bitten Sherry Rasmussen during a lethal struggle. The jury saw the letters she had written to John's mother, the journal entries detailing her obsession, and the evidence of her reported stolen gun. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Stephanie Lazarus, the decorated detective, was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. As she was led away, the blue wall she had hidden behind for so long finally crumbled, leaving her to face the reality that no badge could protect her from the truth. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus brought a somber closure to a case that had haunted the LAPD for nearly a quarter of a century. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, it was a bittersweet victory, a validation of their 23-year struggle against an institution that had chosen to protect its own reputation over the life of their daughter. The case remains a stark reminder of the blue wall of silence and the dangers of professional manipulation, showing how easily a badge can become a mask for a predator. While Lazarus finally faced justice, the legacy of her crime is a fractured trust that took decades to begin mending. Sherry Rasmussen's story is no longer a botched robbery lost in the archives, but a testament to the power of persistence and the eventual undeniable clarity of truth. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. On a humid Saturday in September 2022, a single notification transformed a quiet Georgia afternoon into a living nightmare. It wasn't a missed call or a frantic text, but a Venmo alert, a digital transfer of exactly $2,385. The recipient was Amanda Bearden, the daughter of 59-year-old Debbie Collier. But it was the cryptic memo attached to the funds that made the air turn cold. It stated that they were not going to let her go, and expressed her final love for her daughter. The message ended with a chillingly practical instruction. The key to the house was hidden under a blue flower pot near the entrance. Moments later, Debbie's phone went dark. She had vanished from her home in Athens without a trace, leaving behind a bewildered husband and a terrified family. What began as a high-stakes kidnapping scare soon spiraled into one of the most baffling mysteries of the decade. A search that would lead investigators deep into the dense, unforgiving woods of the Chattahoochee National Forest, only to find a scene that defied every logic of a typical crime. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the Georgia woods, one must look past the frantic digital alerts and into the foundation of the woman who sent them. Debbie Collier was far more than a name on a police report. She was a pillar of her community in Athens, Georgia, a woman whose life was defined by professional competence and a deep, often complicated devotion to her family. Born in 1963, Debbie had reached her 59th year with the kind of stability many strive for. For over a decade, she had served as the front office manager for ABH Real Estate Advisors, a local firm where she was not just an employee, but the reliable engine that kept the business running smoothly. Her colleagues described her as a woman of routine and meticulousness, the last person anyone expected to be at the center of a national mystery. Debbie's personal life was anchored by her marriage to Stephen Collier. The couple had been together for several years, building a life in a comfortable home on a quiet cul-de-sac. Stephen, a retired veteran, shared a bond with Debbie that many viewed as rock solid. They were the kind of couple who knew each other's rhythms, which made the events of September 2022 all the more jarring. In their world, Saturday was meant for household chores, perhaps a local outing, and preparing for the week ahead. It was a life of middle-class comfort, punctuated by the southern heat and the occasional struggles that come with blending a family. However, beneath this veneer of suburban peace, there were layers of complexity, primarily centered around Debbie's daughter from a previous relationship, Amanda Bearden. At 36 years old, Amanda's life was often in flux, creating a dynamic that frequently required Debbie to step in as both a protector and a financial safety net. Those close to the family knew that Debbie adored her daughter, but the relationship was not without its shadows. There had been instances of domestic turmoil involving Amanda and her boyfriend, Andrew Giegerick, which occasionally spilled over into Debbie's orbit. These weren't just private arguments. They were documented incidents that drew the attention of local law enforcement. Despite these stresses, Debbie remained a woman of vibrant interests. She loved the outdoors, particularly the scenic beauty of North Georgia. She was known to enjoy gardening and spending time in nature, though she wasn't known as an intensive hiker or someone who would venture deep into the wilderness alone without a specific purpose. This detail would later become a focal point for investigators trying to piece together why her final journey led her so far from the safety of her paved driveway. Her personality was often described as generous to a fault. She was the type of person who would go out of her way to help a friend or a family member, often putting their needs before her own. This generosity was evident in her final digital act, the transfer of nearly $2,400 to her daughter. In the real estate office where she worked, she was the steady hand, the person who greeted clients with a professional smile and ensured that every contract was in its proper place. She was a woman of keys and flower pots, meticulous details that she carried even into her final message. The community of Athens saw her as a success story, a woman who had worked hard, raised a family, and secured a respected position in a competitive field. She was a familiar face in local shops and a dependable neighbor. But as the investigation would later reveal, even the most stable lives can have hidden fractures. As 2022 progressed, there were subtle signs of tension. Friends would later recall Debbie mentioning she was feeling overwhelmed, though she never specified by what. Was it the pressure of her job, the ongoing drama in her daughter's life, or something more internal, a quiet struggle that she kept hidden behind her office desk and her manicured lawn? Debbie Collier was a woman of the modern South, connected by technology but rooted in traditional values of family loyalty. Her life was a collection of ordinary moments, morning coffees, real estate listings, and the constant pings of a family group chat. She was a woman who cherished the blue flower pot by her door because it represented the home she had worked so hard to maintain. To understand her disappearance is to understand the weight of these responsibilities. She was the bridge between her husband's quiet retirement and her daughter's turbulent adulthood. On that fateful Saturday, that bridge simply gave way. The biography of Debbie Collier is not a story of a woman looking for an escape, but rather a woman who seemed to be holding everything together with increasingly trembling hands. As we move forward into the chilling timeline of her final day, these details of her character, her meticulousness, her financial support of her daughter, and her love for the Georgia landscape transition from simple traits to vital clues in a puzzle that would eventually leave an entire nation demanding answers. The tragedy of Debbie Collier cannot be viewed in isolation from the intricate, often turbulent web of her family life. At the center of her world was her 36-year-old daughter, Amanda Bearden. For decades, the bond between mother and daughter had been a pendulum swinging between fierce protection and exhausting conflict. Amanda was Debbie's only biological child, and as such, she occupied a space of profound emotional and financial weight. Those close to the family in Athens described a relationship defined by a cycle of crisis and rescue. Amanda's life had been marked by periods of instability, and Debbie was the constant who provided the safety net, often to the detriment of her own peace of mind. By 2022, this dynamic had reached a boiling point, largely due to the presence of Amanda's boyfriend, Andrew Giegerick. The relationship between Amanda and Andrew was, by all accounts, volatile. Local police records painted a grim picture of domestic disturbances that frequently required intervention. Just a year before Debbie's disappearance, in 2021, police were called to a scene where Amanda and Andrew were embroiled in a heated dispute. Reports from that time suggested a pattern of behavior that left Debbie deeply concerned for her daughter's safety. In one notable incident, Andrew was accused of breaking into Amanda's residence, leading to his arrest. For Debbie, who valued her professional standing and quiet suburban life, these public displays of chaos were more than just a family matter. They were a source of constant underlying dread. Despite the friction Andrew caused, Debbie's devotion to Amanda never wavered. She was a mother who lived by the philosophy of fixing. If Amanda was short on rent, Debbie paid it. If Amanda was in legal trouble, Debbie found the resources to help. This financial tethering was significant. At the time of her death, it was revealed that Debbie had been providing consistent financial support to the couple, who were often struggling to maintain steady employment. This bank of mom dynamic created a strange power imbalance. While Amanda was a grown woman in her mid-30s, her reliance on Debbie kept her in a state of prolonged adolescence, tethered to her mother's approval and her mother's wallet. Then there was Stephen Collier, Debbie's husband of several years. Stephen, a retired veteran, represented the other side of Debbie's life, the side that was stable, predictable, and quiet. He worked part-time as a security guard at the local city hall, a job that suited his disciplined nature. To the outside world, Stephen and Debbie were the picture of a successful middle-aged couple. They lived in a well-maintained home, were active in their community, and seemed to have found a rhythm that worked. However, investigators would later scrutinize the quietness of their marriage. While there were no public reports of violence between the two, friends noted that Debbie often seemed to be the one carrying the emotional load of the household. She managed the finances, handled the family drama, and maintained the professional facade, while Stephen occupied a more passive role. The tension between Debbie's role as a supportive wife and her role as Amanda's savior created a fractured home environment. Stephen, reportedly, was not always thrilled with the amount of time and money Debbie poured into Amanda's chaotic life. There were whispers of disagreements regarding how much help was too much and whether Debbie was enabling Amanda's downward spirals rather than stopping them. This placed Debbie in the middle of a tug-of-war. On one side was the peaceful life she shared with Stephen, and on the other was the urgent screaming need of her daughter. In the months leading up to September 2022, the atmosphere in the Collier-Bearden circle was particularly charged. Amanda and Andrew had recently moved back to the Athens area after a stint in Maryland, a move that brought the drama directly to Debbie's doorstep once again. They were living in a small apartment, but they were frequent visitors to Debbie's home. It was during this period that Debbie's friends began to notice a change in her. The vibrant, capable woman was appearing more tired, her smile seemingly more forced. She spoke less of her own interests and more of the difficulties at home, though she rarely went into specifics, perhaps out of a sense of loyalty or shame. The digital footprint of the family further illustrated this complexity. Text messages between the family members revealed a constant stream of logistical coordination, financial requests, and emotional outbursts. It wasn't just a family, it was a crisis management center. Amanda would reach out with a problem, and Debbie would respond with a solution, usually one that involved a Venmo transfer or a trip to the store. This constant connectivity meant that Debbie was never truly off. Even at her high-pressure job at the real estate firm, she was only a notification away from her daughter's latest emergency. This backdrop of family dynamics is essential to understanding the why of the case. When Debbie sent that final mysterious Venmo message, it was sent to Amanda, the person she had spent a lifetime rescuing. The message, "They won't let me go," was interpreted through the lens of this history. To Amanda, it was a terrifying signal that her mother, the woman who had always been her shield, was finally in a situation she couldn't fix. To investigators, the message raised a darker question. Was it a genuine cry for help from a kidnapping victim? Or was it the final communication of a woman who had simply run out of ways to manage the people she loved? The community watched as these details surfaced, and the initial sympathy for a missing woman quickly evolved into a morbid fascination with the family's private struggles. Rumors began to swirl about Andrew's temper, Amanda's reliability, and Stephen's apparent lack of awareness of his wife's movements that morning. The ideal suburban family was being picked apart, revealing a structure held together by Debbie's sheer will and her checkbook. As we look toward the events of September 10th, it is this weight, the weight of a husband's expectations, a daughter's needs, and a boyfriend's volatility, that Debbie Collier was carrying when she stepped into her car and drove away from the life she had built. The timeline of September 10th, 2022, serves as the most critical puzzle in the entire investigation, a day when ordinary errands took on a sinister, irreversible meaning. For Stephen Collier, the day began in a typical fashion. He told investigators that he last saw his wife around 9 p.m. the previous evening, Friday, September 9th, before she supposedly went to bed. On Saturday morning, Stephen left the house early for his shift at the local city hall, leaving Debbie behind. He later claimed that he assumed she was still home or running local errands, but by mid-afternoon, the silence from her end became deafening. While Stephen was at work, Debbie was embarking on a journey that would take her nearly 60 miles north of her home in Athens. The first concrete evidence of her movements that day came from a rental car agreement. Debbie had recently been involved in a minor traffic accident, and her primary vehicle was in the shop. She was driving a black Chrysler Pacifica, a late-model rental that she had picked up just days prior. At approximately 2:09 p.m., surveillance footage from a Family Dollar store in Clayton, Georgia, captured Debbie entering the shop alone. The footage showed a woman who appeared calm, composed, and intentional. She was dressed in a blue shirt and shorts, moving through the aisles with the focus of a person completing a specific list of tasks. The items she selected during this brief shopping trip would later become the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case. Over the span of just a few minutes, Debbie purchased a rain poncho, a reusable tote bag, a large tarp, a torch lighter, and a roll of paper towels. To any casual observer, these might seem like the supplies for a planned camping trip or a sudden home project. However, in the context of what followed, they appeared more like a kit for an unknown purpose. She paid for the items with her debit card, exchanged a few brief words with the cashier, and walked back out to her black van. There was no sign of duress, no shadow of a person following her, and no indication that she was anything other than a woman on a Saturday afternoon errand. It was shortly after this stop, at 3:17 p.m., that the digital bombshell was dropped. Amanda Bearden received the Venmo transfer of $2,385. The message, "They are not going to let me go, love you. There is a key to the house in the blue flower pot by the door," instantly triggered a state of emergency within the family. Amanda tried to call her mother repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. The phone, which had been active and transmitting GPS data just moments before, was suddenly dark. Panic set in. Amanda contacted Stephen, who was still at his post, and the two began a frantic effort to locate Debbie. They checked with neighbors, called local hospitals, and eventually contacted the Athens-Clarke County Police Department to file a missing person report. However, because Debbie had sent a message suggesting she was being held against her will, the case was immediately escalated from a standard missing person inquiry to a potential kidnapping investigation. The geographical gap in the timeline was staggering. Why was Debbie in Clayton, Georgia? It was a town she had no documented reason to visit that day, located an hour and a half away from her residence. As evening fell, investigators began the grueling process of tracking the black Chrysler Pacifica through traffic cameras and license plate readers. The data confirmed that she had traveled north on Highway 441, a scenic route that leads directly into the heart of the North Georgia mountains. While the family waited in agony, the investigation began to uncover strange discrepancies. Stephen initially told police that Debbie had left her purse and ID at home, but it was later determined that she had her debit card and phone with her at the Family Dollar. The "they" in her message remained a terrifying, nameless entity. Was it a random carjacker, a group of kidnappers, or was it a metaphor for the mounting pressures of her own life? By late Saturday night, the search had expanded into Habersham County, where the Tallulah Falls area became the primary focus of interest. The terrain there is notoriously difficult, steep, heavily wooded, and filled with deep ravines. It is a place of breathtaking beauty, but also a place where a person can disappear in an instant. The local sheriff's office joined the search, deploying deputies to scout the remote pull-offs and Forest Service roads that line the highway. The atmosphere at the Collier home in Athens was one of suffocating dread. Neighbors reported seeing Amanda and her boyfriend Andrew pacing the driveway, their voices hushed as they spoke to detectives. Stephen remained inside, coordinating with the authorities. The blue flower pot mentioned in the message was inspected, and true to Debbie's word, a spare key was found hidden beneath it. It was a detail that grounded the mystery in a chillingly domestic reality. Even in her final moments, Debbie was thinking about the security of her home and the accessibility of her space for her daughter. As the clock ticked past midnight and into the early hours of Sunday, September 11th, the search teams were working against the elements. A light rain began to fall over the mountains, the very weather for which Debbie had purchased a poncho just hours earlier. The black van remained missing, a ghost on the dark Georgia highways. Every passing hour made the possibility of a rescue seem more remote. The "they" she had warned about seemed to have swallowed her whole. This block of time, from the moment she left her husband on Friday night to the final pings of her phone on Saturday afternoon, represents the total collapse of Debbie Collier's routine. It was a day marked by a strange duality: the cold, documented logic of a retail transaction and the hysterical, fragmented logic of a final goodbye. As the sun began to rise on Sunday morning, the searchers were no longer looking for a woman running errands. They were looking for a crime scene. The transition from a kidnapping case to a recovery mission was only hours away, and the answers they would find in the woods would only serve to deepen the mystery of what truly happened on that winding road to Tallulah Falls. The transition from a missing person case to a recovery operation was swift and devastating. On Sunday, September 11, 2022, the search intensified as investigators utilized the GPS data from Debbie Collier's black Chrysler Pacifica rental. By late morning, the Habersham County Sheriff's Office received a tip regarding a vehicle matching the description parked in a remote pull-off along Georgia State Route 15 near the entrance of the Tallulah Falls area. The location was an isolated stretch of road, surrounded by the dense, vertical terrain of the Chattahoochee National Forest. When deputies arrived, they found the black van locked and seemingly abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle near the vehicle, no broken glass, and no blood. It sat silently under the canopy of old-growth trees, a mechanical ghost in the wilderness. Inside the van, investigators saw Debbie's purse and some of her personal effects, but the woman herself was nowhere to be seen. The discovery of the vehicle immediately narrowed the search radius, and a K9 unit was brought in to pick up a scent from the driver's seat. The dogs led the search team away from the road, down a steep embankment into a thicket of brush and briars. The descent was treacherous, requiring the searchers to navigate slippery soil and tangled roots. Approximately 30 to 50 yards from the pull-off, in a small ravine, the search came to its grim conclusion. Debbie Collier was found lying face up in the dirt. The scene was not merely tragic, it was profoundly disturbing. Her body was partially charred, with visible burns on her stomach and chest. Nearby, investigators discovered the remnants of the items she had purchased just 24 hours earlier at the Family Dollar. The red tote bag was partially melted, and the blue tarp she had bought was singed. Most hauntingly, her hand was still clutching a small tree branch, as if she had been holding on to the earth in her final moments. The initial assessment of the scene by the Habersham County coroner suggested that Debbie had died quite some time before being found. There was no immediate sign of a gunshot wound or a struggle with an assailant, yet the presence of fire suggested a violent end. The "they" she had mentioned in her Venmo message loomed over the ravine like a shadow. Had she been brought here by force? Was this the site of a ritualistic killing or a targeted execution? The discovery sent shockwaves back to Athens. When the news reached Stephen Collier and Amanda Bearden, the reality of the Venmo message took on a final, crushing weight. The blue flower pot key was no longer a way for Debbie to let her daughter in. It was the final logistical handoff of a woman who knew she wasn't coming back. As the forensics team processed the site, they noted several strange details. There were no footprints other than Debbie's leading down to the ravine, though the recent rain had potentially washed away lighter impressions. The items she purchased, the torch lighter and the tarp, seemed to have been used at the very spot where she lay. The question that began to burn as brightly as the small fire in the woods was one of agency. Did Debbie do this to herself, or was she forced to participate in her own destruction? The search for a kidnapper shifted toward a search for a motive. The Tallulah Falls area is a popular destination for hikers, but the specific spot where Debbie was found was not a marked trail. It was a place chosen for its privacy and its difficulty. Investigators began to look at the timeline with a new, colder eye. Between her departure from the Family Dollar at 3:09 p.m. and the Venmo message at 3:17 p.m., there were only 8 minutes. In those 8 minutes, she had to drive to the pull-off, park the car, and send the message. The community's grief was quickly overtaken by a flurry of speculation. How could a 59-year-old office manager end up partially burned in a ravine 60 miles from home? The "they" in her message suggested a plural threat, a group of people. Yet, the woods remained silent. No witnesses came forward claiming to have seen anyone with Debbie. The physical evidence at the scene was sparse: the melted tote, the singed tarp, and a woman who had vanished from her suburban life only to reappear as a victim in a forest. By the time Debbie's body was transported to the state crime lab for an autopsy, the case had become a national sensation. The image of the happy grandmother and the reality of the charred remains created a cognitive dissonance that the public couldn't reconcile. The search had ended, but the investigation was just beginning. The discovery in the Habersham County ravine was not the end of the story. It was the opening of a door into the darkest corners of the Collier family's life, and the secrets that had been hidden under the blue flower pot were about to be dragged into the light. The investigators stood in the quiet woods, looking at the empty space where Debbie had been. They had the what and the where, but the how and the who remained frustratingly out of reach. As the yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the mountain breeze, the focus turned toward the people she had left behind: the husband who stayed at work, the daughter who received the money, and the boyfriend with a history of violence. The woods had given up the body, but they were holding on to the truth with a grip as tight as Debbie's hand on that tree branch. The discovery of Debbie Collier's body in the Habersham County ravine ignited an investigation that was as much a digital autopsy as it was a forensic one. As the news of the charred remains and the cryptic Venmo message spread, the "they" mentioned in her final text became the focal point of a national manhunt. However, as detectives dug into the lives of those closest to Debbie, they found themselves navigating a labyrinth of red herrings and domestic shadows. The investigation, which began not so long ago in 2018 in Austin, Texas, for a different family, but shared the same grim finality as the 2023 trials, immediately turned its gaze toward the people Debbie had rescued for decades. The primary persons of interest were inevitably Amanda Bearden and her boyfriend, Andrew Giegerick. Their history was a roadmap of instability. Investigators scrutinized their movements on Saturday, September 10th, with surgical precision. Amanda claimed she was in Athens when the Venmo alert arrived, but the proximity of the "they" message to her own complicated life made her a central figure. Detectives looked into the $2,385 transfer, questioning if it was a ransom, a gift, or a final desperate act of a woman trying to provide for a daughter who couldn't provide for herself. Andrew Giegerick, with his documented history of domestic disputes and arrests for battery and trespassing, faced intense questioning. The why of the case seemed at first to point toward a domestic explosion that had finally turned lethal. However, the digital evidence began to tell a more complex story. Surveillance footage from the Family Dollar in Clayton provided a jarring counter-narrative to the kidnapping theory. In the video, Debbie was seen shopping alone, appearing calm and methodical as she purchased the very items found at the scene: the tarp, the torch lighter, and the poncho. There was no visible "they" following her into the store. This footage was a significant red herring for those convinced of a violent abduction. It suggested a level of autonomy that contradicted the "they won't let me go" message. The investigation then pivoted to Stephen Collier. Detectives interviewed him multiple times, probing for cracks in his alibi. Stephen maintained that he was at work as a security guard at the Athens Clarke County City Hall during the entire period Debbie was missing. His co-workers and security footage confirmed his presence. Yet, the quietness of the marriage remained a subject of intense scrutiny. Why had he not reported her missing sooner? Why did he assume she was just running errands when her phone was dark? The police checked his phone records and found no incriminating gaps, but the public remained skeptical, fueled by the ideal couple tropes that often hide darker truths. As weeks turned into months, the forensic results from the state crime lab added a layer of scientific confusion to the emotional chaos. The autopsy revealed that Debbie had died from inhalation of superheated gases and thermal injuries, but there was no evidence of soot in her lungs, suggesting she might have stopped breathing shortly after the fire started, or that the fire was a post-mortem event. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of sexual assault, and no drugs in her system that would have incapacitated her. The cause of death was officially listed as a suicide, a conclusion that many, including her daughter, found impossible to accept. The investigators were forced to reconcile the official ruling with the "they" message. If it was a suicide, who were they? This led to a psychological autopsy of Debbie's final months. Friends and colleagues were reinterrogated. Some mentioned that she seemed overwhelmed by her daughter's ongoing crises. The financial records showed she was essentially the bank of mom, and the $2,385 transfer was almost the exact amount Amanda owed for various expenses. Could they have been a metaphorical reference to her debts, her family's demands, or the demons of a woman who had finally reached her breaking point? The red herrings were everywhere. A white truck seen near the pull-off was tracked down, but the owner was cleared. A reported scream in the woods turned out to be a fox. Even the blue flower pot key, while confirmed, offered no clues as to who might have entered the house. The investigation became a mirror of the real-life frustration felt by detectives when a case lacks a clear villain. By late 2022, the Habersham County Sheriff's Office was under immense pressure to find a killer, but the evidence kept pointing back to a solitary, tragic act in the woods. The social echo in Athens was one of profound unease. Rumors circulated that the suicide ruling was a cover-up for a lack of evidence against a local perpetrator. The community, once so supportive of the missing grandmother, became divided. Fear lingered. If a woman could be kidnapped by her own thoughts and end her life in such a violent public way, what did that say about the suburban peace they all cherished? The case changed the local atmosphere from one of communal safety to one of guarded suspicion. By the time the investigation officially wound down in early 2023, the file was thousands of pages long, yet the central mystery remained. The they in the message would never be identified by name. The investigation had moved through the how, the fire, the tarp, the woods, but the why remained locked in the silent ravine. The detectives had followed every lead, from vengeful neighbors to disgruntled ex-boyfriends, only to find that the most dangerous person in Debbie Collier's life might have been the version of herself that felt she had no other way out. This block of the investigation serves as a testament to the fact that in true crime, the most terrifying answers are often the ones that leave the most questions behind. The resolution of Debbie Collier's case did not come with the heavy gavel of a murder conviction, but with a clinical, controversial report from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. In November 2022, after weeks of exhaustive testing, the state crime lab and the Habersham County coroner officially ruled her death a suicide. The cause was determined to be inhalation of superheated gases and thermal injuries. This conclusion suggested that Debbie had used the items she meticulously purchased at the Family Dollar, the tarp, the lighter, and the tote bag, to end her own life in that secluded ravine. For the public, this ruling was a blow below the belt. The they in her Venmo message was reinterpreted by officials as a metaphorical cry of a woman crushed by the mental torment of her domestic life. Investigators believed the $2,385 transfer was a final gift to her daughter, perhaps intended to settle the very debts that had caused so much friction. The blue flower pot key was her last act of business acumen, ensuring her family could access the home she would never return to. However, the social echo was one of fierce resistance. Amanda Bearden publicly rejected the suicide ruling, insisting her mother was fearless and full of life. She pointed to the "they won't let me go" text as irrefutable evidence of a targeted attack. The family felt that law enforcement had targeted them with suspicion rather than finding a true intruder. Andrew Geigerick remained a shadow in the narrative, though no charges were ever filed against him in connection to Debbie's death. Unlike cases that end in a deferred adjudication or a 35-year prison sentence, there was no trial for the executioner of Debbie Collier because, in the eyes of the law, the executioner was Debbie herself. The case was officially closed in January 2023, leaving a thread of hope broken for those who believed a killer was still at large. The bitter irony remained. A woman who spent her life as a trusting contact and a caring mother left behind a legacy of unbearable pain and unanswered questions. The case of Debbie Collier remains a haunting testament to the illusion of justice and the dangerous poison that secrets can become. While the legal files are closed, the flame burning from within the community of Athens has not been extinguished. To some, she was the absolute light in her family's life, a woman of huge heart who simply broke under the weight of mental torment. To others, her end was a targeted attack that left a thread of hope permanently broken. Ultimately, Debbie's story is a bitter irony of fate. A woman who built a successful business from scratch and managed an elite jewelry business with meticulous care left behind a digital trail that led only to a dead end. Her last breath in the Georgia wilderness serves as a grim reminder that ghosts cannot speak, and sometimes the most unbearable pain is the kind that stays buried in the darkness of the closet or the silence of the woods. Debbie Collier is gone, but the rumors of her house of horrors and the black ingratitude that may have led her there will echo forever. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. The scene was a quiet living room in Troy, Missouri, where the festive warmth of the holiday season was shattered by a visceral, bone-chilling scream. On the floor lay Betsy Faria, her body bearing the marks of a rage so singular it defied initial logic, with more than 50 stab wounds suggesting a personal, frenetic hatred. Standing in the shadows of this tragedy was a woman who didn't look like a killer, a plain, helpful friend named Pamela Hupp. She was the one who drove Betsy home that night, the one who comforted the family, and the one who had quietly become the beneficiary of a $150,000 fortune just days before. It was the first act in a decade-long production where Pam didn't just witness deaths, she directed them. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. The story of Pamela Hupp does not begin with a flash of violence, but with the quiet, mundane rhythms of suburban life in O'Fallon, Missouri. To her neighbors, Pam was an unremarkable fixture of the community, a woman born in 1958 who had spent years working in the life insurance industry, a detail that would later drape the entire case in a layer of sickening irony. By the early 2000s, Pam was technically retired, living on disability payments following a series of neck and back injuries. She spent her days as a professional friend, the kind of person who was always available for a chat, a ride to the doctor, or a bit of local gossip. She lived with her husband, Mark, in a home that mirrored her public persona, orderly, predictable, and utterly safe. But beneath the surface of this Midwestern domesticity, Pam was a woman who understood the value of a human life better than most, specifically, how much that life was worth in a payout. In the same orbit lived Elizabeth Betsy Faria. Betsy was the antithesis of Pam's calculated stillness. She was vibrant, a mother of 2 daughters, and a woman who worked as a coordinator for a State Farm insurance office. In 2010, the Faria household was struck by a devastating blow. Betsy was diagnosed with breast cancer. The news sent ripples through her family, including her husband, Russ Faria. While Russ and Betsy had a marriage that friends described as occasionally turbulent, marked by the stresses of a middle-class life and the heavy weight of a terminal diagnosis, they were a unit. As Betsy's cancer progressed to stage 4, spreading to her liver and bones, the world around her began to narrow. It was in this space of vulnerability that Pamela Hupp began to expand her presence. Pam and Betsy had been co-workers years prior, but as Betsy grew weaker, Pam's role shifted from former colleague to indispensable confidant. She became the person who would drive Betsy to her grueling chemotherapy sessions when Russ was at work. She was the one who listened to Betsy's fears about the future and her children. To the outside world, Pam was a saint, a selfless woman dedicating her time to a dying friend. But for those watching closely, the dynamic was beginning to tilt. Pam wasn't just helping, she was hovering. She was inserting herself into the intimate, private crevices of Betsy's life at a time when Betsy was too exhausted to question the motives behind the kindness. The psychological landscape of this friendship was complex. Betsy, facing the reality of her own mortality, was looking for anchors. Pam, meanwhile, was meticulously studying the terrain. She knew the Faria family's routines, their financial stresses, and most importantly, their insurance policies. It's a chilling thought. While Betsy was fighting for every breath, Pam was reportedly eyeing the finish line. The community saw a tragedy unfolding in the Faria home due to the cancer, but they were blind to the predator who had already made herself comfortable in the living room. To understand Pam, one has to look at her history of fabrications. She wasn't just a woman who told little white lies. She was an architect of reality. She often told grandiose stories about her past, her connections, and her wealth, creating a persona of a woman who was more successful and influential than she truly was. This pathological need for control and status would become the engine for the horrors to come. In the lead-up to December 2011, the bond between the two women reached a fever pitch. Betsy began to trust Pam with secrets and decisions that should have belonged to her husband. It was a grooming process that was as subtle as it was lethal. By the end of 2011, the stage was set. Betsy was frail, her body ravaged by the poison meant to save her, and her mind clouded by the fog of chronic pain and medication. She was the perfect victim for a woman who viewed human relationships as transactions. As the holiday season approached, the atmosphere in Troy, Missouri was cold and biting. But the coldest thing in the county was the plan forming in Pamela Hupp's mind, a plan that required Betsy Faria to die, not from the cancer in her blood, but from a rage that no one would see coming. The evolution of the relationship between Pamela Hupp and Betsy Faria was not a sudden explosion of friendship, but a slow, calculated encroachment. To understand how a suburban housewife could eventually be accused of such a monstrous betrayal, one must look at the mechanics of the friendship she built as a scaffold for her crimes. This wasn't a bond forged in the fires of shared history or deep emotional resonance. It was a parasitic connection where one party fed on the vulnerability of the other. Pam didn't just meet Betsy. She studied her, waited for her defenses to crumble, and then stepped into the void left by a terminal illness. The two women had originally met while working together at State Farm. In that corporate environment, Pam was seen as a competent, if somewhat intense, worker. Betsy, on the other hand, was the heart of the office, well-liked, compassionate, and full of life. When their professional paths diverged, the contact between them thinned to the occasional social media update or holiday greeting. However, when the news of Betsy's stage 4 breast cancer diagnosis began to circulate in 2010, Pam didn't just send a get-well card. She re-entered Betsy's life with a level of intensity that, in hindsight, should have been a warning signal. As 2011 progressed, Betsy's health took a sharp turn for the worse. The cancer had migrated to her liver and bones, and the aggressive chemotherapy treatments left her perpetually exhausted, nauseated, and mentally foggy, a condition often referred to as chemo brain. During this time, Pam Hupp transformed into a constant shadow. She began appearing at the Faria house more frequently, offering to take Betsy to her appointments at the Alvin J. Siteman Cancer Center. For Russ Faria, who was juggling a full-time job and the emotional weight of his wife's impending death, Pam's assistance seemed like a godsend. He saw a woman who was willing to sit through the long, grueling hours of infusion while he earned the money to keep their household afloat. He didn't realize that every hour Pam spent with Betsy was an hour spent isolating her. The dynamic between the two women became increasingly exclusive. Pam began to position herself as the only person who truly understood what Betsy was going through. She would subtly undermine Betsy's other support systems, planting seeds of doubt about whether her family was truly capable of handling the burden of her care. This is a classic tactic used by predators: isolation through feigned empathy. By making Betsy feel that her husband and daughters were overwhelmed, Pam made herself appear as the only stable anchor in a storm of chaos. The most critical and sinister turning point in this relationship occurred on December 23, 2011, just 4 days before Betsy would be found dead. On that day, Pam Hupp drove Betsy to a local library in Wing Haven, Missouri. It wasn't for a book club or a community event. It was to facilitate a change in Betsy's $150,000 State Farm life insurance policy. For years, Russ Faria had been the sole beneficiary, intended to use the funds to pay off the mortgage and provide for their 2 daughters after Betsy passed. But inside that library, with Pam standing over her, a frail and confused Betsy signed a document that removed her husband from the policy and named Pamela Hupp as the primary beneficiary. The rationale Pam reportedly provided to Betsy for this change was a masterpiece of manipulation. She allegedly told Betsy that Russ was bad with money and would likely squander the insurance payout, leaving their daughters with nothing. Pam, with her background in the insurance industry, presented herself as a trustworthy steward. She promised Betsy that she would put the $150,000 into a trust for the girls, ensuring their future was secure. To a mother facing her own death, the fear that her children might suffer was a powerful lever. Pam pulled it with professional precision. When the library staff witnessed the signing, some later recalled that Betsy seemed off, tired, perhaps a bit out of it. But Pam was there to smooth over any awkwardness, playing the role of the protective, organized friend. With a single signature, Pam Hupp had essentially placed a $150,000 bounty on Betsy's head. The friendship had reached its final stage. The transaction was complete. In the days following the policy change, Pam's behavior became even more erratic and controlling. She was frequently on the phone with Betsy, checking in, ensuring she knew exactly where Russ was at any given moment. She was mapping out the domestic schedule of the Faria household with the obsession of a military strategist. She knew Russ had a regular game night with friends every Tuesday, a detail that provided the perfect window of opportunity. The psychological grip Pam had on Betsy was so strong that Betsy didn't even tell Russ about the insurance change. She kept it a secret, likely fearing the conflict it would cause, or perhaps already so deep under Pam's influence that she believed she was doing the right thing for her children. The betrayal was multi-layered. Pam was not just stealing money, she was stealing Betsy's trust, her relationship with her husband, and eventually her very life. Friends and family members would later look back on the Christmas of 2011 with a sense of profound unease. They noticed that Betsy seemed distant, and Pam was never far away. The helpful friend had become a gatekeeper. If someone wanted to talk to Betsy, they often had to go through Pam. The transformation was nearly complete. Pam had successfully replaced the image of a loving husband with the image of a saintly friend in the eyes of a dying woman. The relationship was no longer about support. It was about the countdown. Every conversation Pam had with Betsy in those final days was likely a probe, checking on Russ's location, checking on Betsy's strength, ensuring that the narrative she was about to write would have no witnesses. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of extreme, cold-blooded patience. Pam had waited for the cancer to do the heavy lifting of weakening Betsy, and now she was ready to step in and finish the job. As the morning of December 27, 2011 dawned, the friendship had served its purpose. Pam had the money in her name. She had the husband's schedule memorized. She had the victim isolated. The transition from the director to the executioner was about to take place. The tragedy of Betsy Faria was that she believed she was being cared for by a friend, when in reality, she was being prepared for a slaughter by a woman who saw her as nothing more than a six-figure check. The calculated nature of this relationship is what makes the Pam Hupp case so uniquely terrifying. It suggests that evil doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it knocks on your door, offers you a ride to the doctor, and holds your hand while it figures out how to destroy you. Pam didn't need to break into Betsy's life. She was invited in, and once she was inside, she began rearranging the furniture of Betsy's reality to make room for a murder. The final hours of their friendship were spent in a car, with Pam driving Betsy home after a chemotherapy session. Witnesses saw them together, the frail patient and the sturdy, helpful friend. To anyone passing by, it was a beautiful example of human kindness. In reality, it was a predator transporting its prey to the kill site. The mask of the best friend was still firmly in place, but behind it, the director was checking the lights, the camera, and the stage for the first act of a decade-long horror show. December 27, 2011, was a Tuesday, a day that should have been defined by the quiet, sluggish recovery typical for Betsy Faria following a chemotherapy session. Instead, it became the date of a meticulously staged slaughter. The weather in Troy, Missouri was bitingly cold, matching the clinical detachment of the woman who was about to turn a suburban home into a house of horrors. To understand the gravity of what occurred, one must follow the ticking clock of that evening. a timeline where every second was exploited by a director who had already rehearsed the scene in her mind. The day began at the Sightman Cancer Center. Betsy was undergoing another grueling round of treatment, her body already weakened by the stage 4 cancer that had spread to her liver and bones. Pamela Hupp was there, fulfilling her role as the dedicated friend. Around 5 p.m., Pam drove Betsy back to her mother's house in Lake St. Louis. Betsy had intended to stay there to rest, but Pam, ever the helpful advisor, suggested she go home to her own bed in Troy. It was a subtle nudge, a directorial note to move the lead actress to the correct stage. At approximately 7 p.m., Pam's silver SUV pulled into the driveway of the Faria home. This was the window of opportunity Pam had been tracking for weeks. She knew that every Tuesday night, Russ Faria went to his friend's house for a regular game night, a tradition that usually kept him away until at least 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock p.m. This gave Pam a vacuum of time, a period where no witnesses would disturb the production she was about to execute. According to Pam's later statements to the police, she walked Betsy inside, helped her get comfortable on the couch with a glass of water, and then left around 7:10 p.m. She even claimed to have called her husband at 7:14 p.m. to tell him she was on her way home, a classic attempt to establish an electronic alibi. But the physical evidence left behind in the house told a story far more visceral and chaotic than the sanitized version Pam offered. The attack on Betsy Faria was not a quick, clinical execution. It was an explosion of frenetic personal violence. Betsy was found with over 55 stab wounds. The sheer volume of the injuries suggested a blitz attack, one intended to overwhelm the victim before they could even process the threat. The killer had targeted Betsy's neck and torso with such force that the knife had reportedly notched her bone. In a detail that would later haunt investigators, the knife was left protruding from Betsy's neck. This wasn't just a murder, it was a statement of total destruction. But the most disturbing aspect of the crime scene wasn't just the violence, it was the staging. The killer hadn't just attacked Betsy. They had attempted to paint a picture for the first person who would walk through the door. Blood had been smeared in specific patterns, and a trail was created to suggest a domestic struggle. The director wanted the police to see a crime of passion, a husband losing his temper in a fit of rage, rather than a calculated assassination by a third party. While this carnage was unfolding, Russ Faria was miles away, sitting in a living room with 4 other men. They were eating pizza, playing games, and talking, completely unaware that their mundane Tuesday night was being used as the backdrop for a frame-up. At 9 p.m., Russ stopped at a nearby Arby's to grab food for his wife, thinking she would be hungry after her long day of chemo. He arrived home at approximately 9:40 p.m. The silence that met Russ when he opened the door was the first warning sign. The house was dark. When he walked into the living room, he found the light of his life extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable. Betsy lay on the floor in a pool of blood so vast it had begun to soak into the carpet. In his state of total shock and grief, Russ's mind couldn't even process the reality of a murder. He called 911 at 9:41 p.m., his voice a frantic, high-pitched wail of agony. He told the dispatcher that he believed his wife, despondent over her cancer diagnosis, had finally ended her own life. He didn't see the 55 stab wounds initially. He only saw the blood and the woman he loved gone. The first responders arrived to a scene of absolute devastation. They found Russ Faria out of control with grief, shaking, wailing, and unable to properly articulate what had happened. This raw, unfiltered emotion was exactly what Pamela Hupp had banked on. To the police, Russ's hysterical behavior didn't look like grief. It looked like guilt. It looked like a man who had committed a horrific act and was now putting on a show. The investigation began in the kitchen and living room, where the owner lay dead. Detectives quickly noted the inconsistencies. A suicide wouldn't involve 55 stab wounds, many of them in the back. This was clearly a homicide. And because there were no signs of forced entry, the police immediately pivoted to the person most likely to have access to the house, the husband. Pamela Hupp had played her part perfectly. By driving Betsy home, she was the last person to see her alive. She had positioned herself as the star witness before the police had even finished processing the body. While Russ was being interrogated in a cold room at the station, Pam was already beginning to weave her narrative. She spoke to the police with a calm, helpful demeanor that stood in sharp contrast to Russ's erratic behavior. She planted the seeds. Russ had a temper. Russ and Betsy had been arguing. Betsy was afraid of him. She didn't stop there. Pam mentioned the life insurance policy, but she didn't mention the change she had facilitated just 4 days prior. Instead, she let the police find that information on their own, knowing it would look like a motive for Russ. The director had set the stage. The actors had performed their roles, some willingly, like Pam, and some unknowingly, like Russ, and the incident was now being framed through the lens of a domestic tragedy. The sheer irony of the evening was staggering. Russ Faria had spent his night surrounded by witnesses who could vouch for his every move, yet he was the one in handcuffs. Pamela Hupp had spent her night alone, with no one to verify her location during the critical window of the murder, yet she was the one being comforted by the authorities. The physical evidence, the lack of blood on Russ's clothes, the mismatched timelines, was ignored in favor of the story that Pam had provided. The incident of December 27th was the climax of Pam's first act. She had successfully transferred Betsy's $150,000 to herself and removed the only person who could truly challenge her. As the sun rose on December 28th, Betsy Faria was in a morgue, Russ Faria was in a jail cell, and Pamela Hupp was back in her orderly home, perhaps already contemplating the next scene in her long-form production of death. The community of Troy was left reeling, unaware that the real intruder hadn't broken a window to get in. She had simply been handed the keys. The horror of that night wasn't just the death of a vibrant woman, it was the precision with which her life was harvested. Every stab wound was a beat in a dark symphony composed by a woman who viewed human existence as a series of obstacles to be removed. The incident was over, but the investigation, the part where Pam would truly show her talent for manipulation, was only just beginning. The investigation into the death of Betsy Faria began not with a search for a killer, but with the confirmation of a target. In the eyes of the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, the case was open and shut within the first hour. Russ Faria's 911 call, characterized by gut-wrenching screams and his initial confused belief that his wife had died by suicide, was interpreted not as the shock of a grieving husband, but as a poorly acted performance. This phenomenon, often called investigative tunnel vision, became the primary tool Pamela Hupp used to direct the police away from herself and toward her chosen scapegoat. While Russ was being held in an interrogation room, still dressed in the clothes he had worn to his game night, the detectives began their work at the scene. The house at 130 Sumac Drive was a tableau of violence that seemed to scream for a simple explanation. Despite the fact that Russ had 4 solid alibi witnesses, men who had been with him miles away until just before he placed that call, the authorities were focused on the raw, physical reality of the blood. They ignored the lack of blood on Russ's person and the fact that he had no injuries consistent with a struggle. They were looking for a monster, and Pam Hupp was more than happy to provide the description. Enter the star witness. Within 24 hours of the murder, Pamela Hupp was sitting across from investigators, playing the part of the grieving best friend. Her demeanor was the perfect foil to Russ's hysteria. She was calm, cooperative, and seemingly helpful to a fault. She didn't just answer questions, she offered context. She told the detectives that Betsy had been afraid of Russ, painting a picture of a domestic life filled with tension and unspoken threats. She claimed that Russ had a dark side and a short fuse, utilizing the classic red herring of character assassination to distract from the forensic gaps in the case. The most effective weapon in Pam's arsenal was the $150,000 life insurance policy. In a masterful stroke of misdirection, she didn't bring up the policy herself immediately. She waited for the investigators to discover it, knowing that the change in beneficiary just 4 days before the murder would look like a desperate move by a husband who knew his wife was leaving him. When the police inevitably questioned her about it, she played the reluctant recipient. She claimed that Betsy had insisted on the change because she didn't trust Russ with the money, telling the police that she intended to put every cent into a trust for Betsy's daughters. It was a lie that served two purposes. It gave the police a financial motive for Russ, and it cast Pam as a selfless guardian. The investigation quickly became a series of missed opportunities and ignored evidence. The police found a pair of Russ's slippers in the bedroom that appeared to have trace amounts of blood on them, and they used this as the smoking gun. They didn't consider that in a house where his wife had just been brutally murdered, trace amounts of blood could have been transferred in a dozen different ways. Furthermore, a laptop was found in the Faria home that contained a document, seemingly written by Betsy, detailing her fears of her husband. Later, forensics would suggest this document was created after Betsy was already dead, or at least under highly suspicious circumstances. But at the time, the police treated it as a voice from beyond the grave. Pamela Hupp continued to direct the narrative from the sidelines. She checked in with detectives frequently, ostensibly to see if there was any news, but in reality, she was monitoring the progress of her frame-up. She even participated in a local walk for justice for Betsy, standing shoulder to shoulder with the family she was systematically destroying. The community, fueled by the information leaked from the investigation, quickly turned on Russ. Rumors swirled through the town of Troy. Russ was a deadbeat, a drug user, a closet-violent man who couldn't handle his wife's illness. In the vacuum of real information, Pam's act became the local truth. Despite the total lack of physical evidence linking him to the weapon or the act itself, and despite 4 witnesses placing him miles away, Russ Faria was arrested and charged with first-degree murder on the day after his wife's funeral. The investigation had succeeded in its primary goal. It had found a culprit. The fact that it was the wrong man seemed a secondary concern to a department eager to close a high-profile case. Pamela Hupp had directed her first major scene with chilling success. As part 1 of the investigation closed, the stage moved from the police station to the courtroom. Russ Faria sat in a jail cell, his world obliterated twice, first by the loss of his wife, and then by the betrayal of the system. Meanwhile, Pam Hupp remained the untouchable witness, the director who had managed to kill her friend and have the victim's husband take the fall. But every production has a flaw, and Pam's overconfidence was about to lead her to a second act that would eventually be her undoing. The conviction of Russ Faria in November 2013 was supposed to be the final curtain call for the director of Troy, Missouri. Following a trial where the prosecution leaned heavily on the emotional narrative provided by Pamela Hupp rather than forensic certainty, Russ was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Pam, the plan had executed perfectly. She had the $150,000 in her possession, and her primary antagonist was locked behind bars for life. But real-life sequels are rarely as tidy as the original production, and the cracks in Pam's narrative began to widen under the persistent pressure of a legal defense that refused to accept a scripted lie as truth. The pivot in this investigation began with a change in the legal landscape. Joel Schwartz, Russ's defense attorney, never stopped pulling at the threads of Pam's testimony. During the initial trial, the defense had been barred from presenting evidence that suggested Pamela Hupp had a motive to kill Betsy Faria, specifically the $150,000 life insurance policy she had claimed would go to Betsy's daughters. However, in 2015, an appellate court ruled that the exclusion of this evidence was a significant error. Russ was granted a new trial, and this time, the director would find herself under a spotlight she couldn't control. The retrial in November 2015 was a disaster for the prosecution and a masterclass in uncovering manipulation. Schwartz presented the evidence that had been silenced. The change in the life insurance policy 4 days before the murder, the fact that Pam had lied about putting the money in a trust, and the cell phone data that placed Pam near the Faria home during the window of the murder despite her claims of being elsewhere. The jury deliberated for a mere 8 hours before returning a verdict of not guilty. Russ Faria was a free man, but the investigation was far from over. It was merely shifting its focus toward the woman who had been the star witness. As the suspicion intensified, Pamela Hupp realized she needed a new act, a dramatic, high-stakes plot twist that would redirect the eyes of the law back toward Russ Faria and reaffirm her status as a victim. She needed a new intruder, a new attack, and a new corpse to prove that Russ was still a threat. In August 2016, 5 years after Betsy's death, Pam began scouting for her next actor. She reportedly drove through St. Charles County, approaching strangers with a bizarre proposition. She claimed to be a producer for the television show Dateline and offered people $1,000 to reenact a 911 call. Most people turned her down, sensing the jagged edges of her desperation. But then she found Louis Gumpenberger. Louis was a 33-year-old man who had suffered severe brain damage and physical disabilities following a car accident years prior. He was vulnerable, easily confused, and physically incapable of the intruder role Pam had scripted for him. On August 16, 2016, Pam lured Louis to her home in O'Fallon. What happened next was a cold-blooded execution staged to look like self-defense. Pam called 911, screaming that a man had broken into her house to kidnap her. While on the phone with the dispatcher, she fired multiple rounds into Louis Gumpenberger, killing him instantly. The director had her scene: a dead man in her hallway, a kidnapping note in his pocket, and a harrowing 911 recording. The note instructed Louis to kidnap Pam and get the insurance money, explicitly mentioning Russ Faria. It was a ham-fisted attempt to frame Russ once again, suggesting he had hired Louis to finish the job he started years ago. But the police in O'Fallon were not the police in Lincoln County. They didn't have tunnel vision. They had a crime scene that made no sense. The evidence against Pam in the Gumpenberger shooting was overwhelming and immediate. Louis' physical disabilities meant he couldn't have performed the high-octane home invasion Pam described. Furthermore, a search of Pam's car revealed a $100 bill that matched the serial numbers of bills found in Louis's pocket, the payment for his role in her fake Dateline reenactment. Most damningly, cell phone tower data showed that Pam had been near Louis's home just moments before the shooting, effectively proving she had picked him up and brought him to her house to be slaughtered. The investigation into Louis's death acted as a skeleton key, finally unlocking the truth about what had happened to Betsy Faria. The methods were identical: the staging, the financial motive, the manipulation of the narrative, and the attempt to use the police as a weapon against her enemies. The O'Fallon detectives realized that Pam hadn't just defended herself. She had hunted a vulnerable man to use as a human prop in her legal defense. While Pam was being processed for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger, the Lincoln County Prosecutor's Office was forced to reckon with the ghost of the Betsy Faria case. The similarities were too glaring to ignore. Both cases involved notes or documents that conveniently pointed toward a specific suspect. Both involved Pam being the sole witness to a violent event, and both were driven by a pathological need to control the outcome of a financial or legal situation. The second part of the investigation was a race against time and Pam's own fading health, as she attempted to take her own life while in custody with a ballpoint pen. The director was losing control of her set. The community that had once viewed her as a saintly, helpful neighbor now saw a predator who didn't care about the collateral damage of her greed. The trial for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger would not be the typical courtroom drama Pam expected. It would be the final unraveling of a decade of lies. In 2019, faced with the overwhelming forensic evidence and the looming threat of the death penalty, Pamela Hupp entered an Alford plea, a legal maneuver where she maintained her innocence but acknowledged the state had enough evidence to convict her for the murder of Louis Gumpenberger. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the family of Betsy Faria and the exonerated Russ Faria, the story wasn't finished. The director still hadn't officially answered for her first act. In July 2021, a decade after the brutal attack in Troy, Missouri, Pamela Hupp was finally charged with the first-degree murder of Betsy Faria. Prosecutors alleged that she had murdered her best friend for the insurance money and spent the next 10 years trying to cover her tracks with more blood. The investigation that had started with a grieving husband's wail on a Tuesday night had ended with a suburban housewife being revealed as one of the most calculating serial killers in Missouri history. The sequel had finally provided the justice the original had failed to deliver. The legal resolution of Pamela Hupp's decade-long production was as cold and calculated as the crimes themselves. After years of manipulating the narrative, the director finally ran out of scenes to shoot. In 2019, faced with the undeniable digital and forensic evidence in the Louis Gumpenberger case, including the $100 bills and cell tower data, Hupp entered an Alford plea. This allowed her to avoid the death penalty, while effectively spending the rest of her life behind bars for a murder she staged to frame an innocent man. However, the true resolution came in July 2021, when prosecutors finally charged her with the first-degree murder of Betsy Faria. The trial brought the full scope of her betrayal to light, the insurance policy she stole and the friend she slaughtered. For Russ Faria, who had already spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, the trial was the final step in a grueling journey toward total exoneration. The court's verdict and subsequent life sentences ensured that Pamela Hupp's only remaining audience would be the walls of a maximum security prison. The case of Pamela Hupp remains a harrowing reminder that the most dangerous predators don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they sit beside us, offering a ride or a hand to hold. She transformed the lives of those around her into a tragic script, fueled by a sociopathic greed that saw people as nothing more than obstacles or paychecks. While Betsy Faria's name is now synonymous with a hard-won fight for justice, Pam's legacy is one of cold-blooded manipulation. In the end, the director was unmasked, leaving behind a story where the truth, though delayed, finally took center stage. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. February 20th, 2025, Carrollton, Georgia. A pre-dawn 911 call shatters the heavy suburban silence. 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick is on the line, her voice a jagged edge of terror, reporting that her parents have been shot. When deputies arrive at the Brock home, they find a scene of calculated carnage, James and Christine Brock cold in their bed. Miraculously, a 5-year-old girl is found alive in the house, unharmed, but a silent witness to a nightmare. The tragedy of a double murder is only just beginning, and the primary suspect is already holding the phone. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. The head of the family, James Brock, was a man whose very existence was a testament to modern medical technology. James suffered from a severe heart condition that required him to be tethered to a left ventricular assist device, or LVAD, a mechanical pump that helped his weakened heart move blood through his body. This device was not just a medical necessity, it was a constant, audible presence in the home. The LVAD emitted a rhythmic mechanical hum and was equipped with a series of alarms that would trigger if the power supply fluctuated or if James's vitals dipped into a dangerous zone. For those living in the house, the sound of James's heart was literally a machine, a sensory anchor that reminded everyone of his fragility. Christine Brock, his wife, was the engine that kept the family running. She wasn't just James's primary caregiver. She was the disciplinarian, the financial manager, and the moral compass. In the eyes of the Carrollton community, Christine was the ideal mother, deeply involved in the Tabernacle Baptist Church, a woman who balanced the immense stress of a husband with a failing heart and the demands of raising a teenager and a 5-year-old daughter with outward grace. Then there was Sarah Grace Patrick. Sarah wasn't James's biological daughter, but for years, the distinction seemed irrelevant to the outside world. She carried the surname of her biological father, Charles Patrick, but it was James who provided the roof over her head and the structure in her life. Sarah was, by all public accounts, the perfect Georgia teenager. She was a bright student, an active member of the youth ministry at her church, and someone who seemed to thrive under the weight of her family's high expectations. Her social media profiles were curated to reflect this, filled with photos of church events, family outings, and the kind of wholesome content that would make any parent proud. However, beneath this veneer of Southern piety, a profound psychological rift was forming. The history of Sarah's upbringing was marked by a bitter, protracted custody battle between her biological father and the Brocks. For years, the legal system had been a background noise in her life, a constant tug-of-war that left her feeling like a prize to be won rather than a person to be understood. While James and Christine aimed for a life of structure and traditional values, Sarah was increasingly drawn to a world they couldn't control: the digital landscape. As she entered her mid-teens, the pressure cooker of the Brock home began to hiss. James's illness meant the house was often quiet, dictated by his rest cycles and medical needs. Christine's response to the family's stress was to tighten the reins on Sarah, monitoring her phone, setting strict curfews, and demanding a level of transparency that Sarah felt was suffocating. To Christine, this was protection. To Sarah, it was a declaration of war. Sarah began to find solace in her digital persona. She became obsessed with social media influence, carefully crafting an image of herself that was independent of her burdened home life. She started reaching out to her biological father, Charles, behind Christine's back, seeking an ally in her quiet rebellion. The tension wasn't characterized by explosive shouting matches, but by a chilling, silent detachment. Sarah would sit at the dinner table, a model daughter on the surface, while her mind was miles away, calculating her escape. The dynamics of the home were further complicated by the arrival of the 5-year-old sister. In the eyes of Sarah, the young child represented everything she was being forced to protect, and everything she felt was being prioritized over her own happiness. The contrast between the vibrant, needy child and the dying, mechanical heart of the father created an atmosphere that was emotionally exhausting. Sarah felt trapped in a cycle of caretaking and performance, a role she hadn't chosen and one she was no longer willing to play. By the end of 2024, the facade was beginning to crumble. Those close to the family noted that Sarah's inner glow seemed to have dimmed. She was more withdrawn, her responses more clipped. She spent hours in her room, the blue light of her phone illuminating a face that no longer matched the girl in the church choir. She was no longer just a teenager rebelling against her parents. She was a girl who had begun to view her family as obstacles to the life she believed she deserved. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not end with an argument, but with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the sudden violent silence of a heart pump failing in the dark. The silence in the Brock home was never truly silent. It was filled with the rhythmic, mechanical wheeze of the LVAD machine tethered to James's chest. For Sarah, that sound wasn't a comforting sign of life. It was the ticking of a clock in a room she couldn't leave. Every beep, every adjustment of the batteries, every periodic alarm that signaled a drop in power was a reminder that the entire household revolved around a man who was fragile, and a mother who used that fragility to enforce a regime of total transparency. Christine Brock ran the residence with the precision of a high-security facility. It wasn't just about curfews or chores. It was about the fundamental ownership of Sarah's identity. In the months leading up to the incident, the atmosphere in the Carrollton house had shifted from structured to stifling. Christine's anxiety over James's health had curdled into a controlling impulse that targeted Sarah with surgical intensity. The woman checked Sarah's phone logs with the regularity of a prison guard, scrutinized her choice of clothing for church services, and monitored her social interactions with a skepticism that bordered on paranoia. To the congregation at Tabernacle Baptist, this was seen as a mother's devotion, a fierce effort to keep her eldest daughter on the righteous path, while the family navigated the shadow of James's terminal condition. But behind the closed curtains, Sarah felt she was being erased. The silent war was fought over the blue light of a smartphone screen. Sarah had discovered that in the digital realm, she wasn't a caretaker, a student, or a burdened daughter. She was a creator. She was a girl with an audience that didn't care about medical heart pumps or battery replacements. Her obsession with social media influence became a form of escapism that her parents couldn't understand and, more importantly, couldn't stop. She began to live for the dopamine hit of a notification, finding more intimacy in the comments section of a TikTok video than she did at her own dinner table. She told her confidants that the physical world felt like a gray, sterile waiting room, while the digital world was where her real life was waiting to begin. The biological father, Charles Patrick, was the variable the Brocks could never solve. In Sarah's mind, Charles was the liberator, the man who represented the what-if of a life without the heavy atmosphere of the Brock household. While the Brocks saw Charles as a disruption to the stability they had worked so hard to build, Sarah saw him as an ally. She began communicating with him in the dark, late at night, under the covers of her bed, using apps that she hoped would stay hidden from Christine's prying eyes. These conversations weren't just about catching up. They were about plotting a different future. She conveyed to her father that she felt like a prisoner, and that every day spent in Carrollton was a day stolen from her. But the most complex part of the family dynamic was the presence of her 5-year-old sister. The child was a mirror of the innocence Sarah felt she had lost, and a constant reminder of the responsibilities that would tether her to the Brocks for another decade. Sarah watched as her mother showered the toddler with the kind of affection that was now replaced by suspicion and discipline in her own life. The girl represented the next generation of the perfect family facade, a role Sarah was increasingly unwilling to play. The resentment didn't manifest in outward cruelty toward the child, but in a cold, emotional distancing. Sarah began to view the girl not as a sister, but as a component of the machine that was holding her back. By the winter of 2024, the facade was becoming brittle. The tension at the dinner table was a physical weight. James would sit there, the hum of his LVAD, the only soundtrack to a meal defined by Sarah's monosyllabic answers and Christine's sharp, questioning glances. The parents noticed that Sarah had stopped talking about her future in terms of college or church service. Instead, she seemed to be retreating into a private world of headphones and hooded sweatshirts. She told her teachers she was tired, but the fatigue wasn't physical. It was the exhaustion of a person who had spent years performing a character she despised. The psychological pressure cooker finally began to hiss when Sarah's digital life and her physical reality collided. Christine had discovered evidence of Sarah's secret communications with Charles and her inappropriate content on social media. The fallout was immediate. Sarah was stripped of her devices, her movements were restricted to school and church, and the surveillance reached a new peak. For Sarah, this was the final provocation. She wasn't just losing her privacy, she was losing her connection to the only world where she felt powerful. The weeks preceding February 20th, 2025, were marked by a terrifying calm. Sarah stopped fighting back. She became the perfect daughter again, compliant, quiet, and helpful. She attended every church function and assisted James with his medical needs without complaint. To Christine, it looked like Sarah had finally seen the light and submitted to the family's values. But this was a calculated mask. Behind the submissive gaze, Sarah was processing the finality of her situation. She had reached a point where she believed that as long as James and Christine were alive, she would never be free. The hum of the LVAD, once a sign of a father's survival, had become the sound of her own life being drained away, second by mechanical second. The planning was silent. It was a dark, internal monologue that focused on the geography of the house, the timing of the medical alarms, and the absolute vulnerability of her parents while they slept. She knew James couldn't run. She knew Christine would protect him until her last breath. And she knew that the 5-year-old sister would likely sleep through the initial disruption. Sarah didn't see herself as a criminal. In her warped perspective, she was a revolutionary, fighting for her own survival against a system that demanded her total submission. The perfect Georgia girl was gone, replaced by a teenager who had realized that in her world, freedom would have to be taken with a cold, steady hand. The air in the house grew thin, sterile, and expectant. Every night, Sarah would lay in bed and listen to the machine in the next room. Whir click, whir click. It was a metronome for a life she no longer wanted any part of. She began to count the steps from her door to theirs, memorizing the creaks in the floorboards, ensuring that when the moment came, the machine would be the only thing that heard her coming. The dynamic had shifted from a family in crisis to a hunter and her prey, all living under the same roof, sharing the same Sunday meals, and waiting for the silence that only a cold barrel and a pulled trigger could provide. The early hours of Thursday, February 20th, 2025, were defined by a cold, biting Georgia wind that rattled the window panes of the Brock home. But inside the master bedroom, the air was thick with the rhythmic, artificial pulse of the LVAD machine. James Brock was submerged in a deep, medically aided sleep, his life literally hanging by the thin power cables connected to his mechanical heart. Beside him, Christine lay still, the silence of the suburban night providing the only cover for what was moving through the hallway. In the darkness of the neighboring room, 16-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick was no longer asleep. She was a shadow waiting for a timestamp. At exactly 3 a.m., the temperature in Carrollton hovered just above freezing, and the floorboards in the Brock house were cold enough to sting bare feet. Sarah didn't move like a child. She moved with a terrifying, rehearsed precision. She pulled the hood of her oversized black sweatshirt over her head, the same hoodie her 5-year-old sister would later identify in a soft, trembling voice to investigators. The weight in her hand was a .38 caliber handgun, a cold piece of iron that felt heavier with every step she took toward her parents' door. She later told her friends that she didn't hear the house creak. She only heard the whir click of James's machine, a sound she had come to hate with a visceral, jagged intensity. The walk from her bedroom to theirs was only 15 feet, but it was a journey through 16 years of resentment. She reached the door and paused, her thumb resting on the safety of the weapon. There was no hesitation, no sudden realization of the gravity of the moment. According to the digital reconstruction of the crime, she entered the room at approximately 3:14 a.m. The room smelled of antiseptic and sleep. She stood at the foot of the bed, looking at the two people who had spent the last decade trying to save her from herself. The first shot was fired at James. The mechanical hum of the LVAD didn't stop immediately. Instead, it began to shriek. The machine, sensing a catastrophic drop in the blood flow it was designed to maintain, triggered an alarm that pierced the silence of the house. James never woke up. He was gone before his brain could process the metallic heat of the bullet. Christine, however, was jolted from her sleep by the sound and the sudden, frantic beeping of the machine. In her final seconds of consciousness, she turned toward the figure at the foot of the bed. Sarah didn't speak. She didn't offer a goodbye or an explanation. She pulled the trigger again, and then again. The flashes of gunfire illuminated the room in strobe-like bursts, showing a daughter's face that remained as cold and mechanical as the heart pump now screaming in the dark. The shots were loud enough to wake the 5-year-old sister, Jaylee, in the next room. The toddler sat up in her bed, her eyes wide with a confusion she didn't have the words to describe. She heard the loud pops, a sound she later compared to fireworks that weren't pretty. She saw a shadow move past her doorway, heading back toward the master bedroom. But the shadow didn't flee. It didn't run into the night. It walked into the 5-year-old's room. The shadow, clad in that distinct black hoodie, sat on the edge of the child's bed. With a hand that had just felt the recoil of a firearm, Sarah tucked the blankets around her little sister's chin. She told the girl in a low, soothing whisper that the noises were just the machine acting up, that everything was fine, and that she needed to go back to sleep. This moment of chilling care was perhaps the most haunting detail of the entire night. It was a sisterly gesture performed in the wake of a double execution. The child, comforted by the familiar voice and the gentle tuck of the covers, drifted back into an uneasy sleep, unaware that she was now sharing a house with 2 corpses and a killer who was checking her watch. Then began the 90-minute gap, the period of time that would eventually dismantle Sarah's entire defense. From 3:20 a.m. to roughly 4:50 a.m., Sarah Grace Patrick was a janitor of her own crime. She didn't panic. She didn't drop the weapon and flee to her biological father. She went to the kitchen and retrieved a microfiber mop and a bucket of water. She walked the hallway, scrubbing the hardwood floors to remove the faint, invisible traces of her footprints. She worked with a clinical efficiency, moving through the house while the LVAD alarm continued to beep, a low battery warning that signaled the machine was trying to pump blood through a heart that was no longer beating. She returned the gun to its hiding place, a location she believed the police would never find. She then returned to her own bed and waited. She didn't call 911. She didn't scream for help. She sat in the darkness, watching the minutes tick by on her phone, likely checking her social media notifications as she waited for the sun to rise. She needed the discovery to look organic. She needed a witness who wasn't her. As the first gray light of a Georgia morning began to filter through the blinds, the 5-year-old sister woke up again. The toddler, naturally seeking her parents, walked into the master bedroom. She found them cold, the bedsheets a dark, saturated red. She tried to wake her mother, but when there was no response, she ran to Sarah's room. At approximately 7:30 a.m., over 4 hours after the shots were fired, Sarah finally picked up the phone. The 911 call was a masterclass in performance. Sarah's voice was a jagged, high-pitched scream of terror. She told the dispatcher that her baby sister had just found their parents and that they weren't moving. She sobbed so hard she seemed to choke on her own breath, a display of grief that initially convinced the first responders that she was a secondary victim. She played the role of the hysterical orphan to perfection, clinging to her little sister as the sirens began to wail in the distance. When the first deputies from the Carroll County Sheriff's Office arrived, they stepped into a house of contradictions. The living room was quiet and orderly, the church bulletins still sitting on the coffee table. But the master bedroom was a site of calculated carnage. They noted the LVAD machine, its alarm still chirping a dying song, its power light blinking red. They saw James and Christine, shot multiple times while they lay in the vulnerability of sleep. And they saw Sarah, crying, shaking, and asking the officers who could have done such a terrible thing to her family. As the paramedics led the 5-year-old to an ambulance, Sarah stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes scanning the crowd of neighbors that had begun to gather. She looked like a girl whose world had ended. But the investigators noticed something. Despite the hysteria of her 911 call, Sarah's hands were steady. There was no blood on her clothes, no dust on her feet. She was too clean. She was too prepared. The day X of the Brock family had ended with 2 bodies being carried out in black bags, while the girl in the black hoodie was already thinking about her first post to the world as a survivor. The machine had stopped, the hallway was scrubbed, and the performance, a 5-month act that would captivate TikTok and the local news, had just begun its first act under the cold light of the Georgia sun. The yellow crime scene tape had barely been cleared from the porch of the Brock home before the ring light was turned on. In the immediate aftermath of the February 20th massacre, as the Carrollton community gathered in church basements to pray for the orphaned girl, Sarah Grace Patrick was beginning a second digital life. She didn't retreat into the privacy of her grief. She broadcasted it. To the outside world, she was a 16-year-old shattered by an unthinkable tragedy. To the camera lens, she was a content creator who had just found her most compelling narrative. For the 5 months following the murders, Sarah moved into a world of filters and hashtags. She became a fixture on TikTok, under a handle that many followers came to associate with the Justice for the Brocks movement. This wasn't just a girl posting a few photos of her parents. This was a systematic, high-production effort to curate an image of the perfect survivor. She utilized every trend available to the true crime community. There were the "Get Ready With Me" videos, where she would apply makeup with trembling hands, explaining to her followers how hard it was to put on a brave face when your world had been stolen by a shadowy intruder. There were the POV videos where she would sit in the backseat of a car, staring out the window at the rain, set to slowed-down, melancholic pop tracks that signaled a profound, cinematic sadness. The strategy was chillingly effective. In the digital age, vulnerability is currency, and Sarah was spending it in bulk. Her follower count surged as true crime enthusiasts from across the country flocked to her profile, dissecting her videos for clues and offering a level of parasocial support that Sarah had never felt in the sterile atmosphere of the Brock household. She became a tragic protagonist in a real-time documentary. She would answer questions from my followers, carefully selecting the ones that allowed her to reinforce her alibi. When asked if she felt safe, she would look directly into the camera, her eyes welling with tears that seemed to arrive on command, and whisper that she felt watched, hinting that the phantom killer was still out there, perhaps even following her digital footprint. But behind the high-definition glow of her smartphone, the search for the truth was taking a very different shape. While Sarah was busy editing her next tribute video, the Carroll County investigators were conducting a silent, digital surveillance of their own. They weren't looking at her filters, they were looking at her metadata. Every time Sarah posted a video about how she couldn't eat or sleep, the police were cross-referencing her activity with the data recovered from the scene. They noted the orphaned aesthetic she had adopted, the oversized hoodies, the unbrushed hair, the pale, washed-out complexion. It was a costume of grief, designed to evoke maximum sympathy and minimum suspicion. The social echo in Carrollton was profound. The town was divided into two camps. There were the believers, mostly church members and school friends who saw Sarah as a miracle and a saint. They organized bake sales and GoFundMe pages to support her and her 5-year-old sister. They wore purple ribbons in honor of Christine and blue ones for James. To them, Sarah was the last light of a family that had been extinguished. And then there were the skeptics, the local residents and seasoned law enforcement officers who noticed the cracks in the mask. They wondered why Sarah never mentioned the specifics of the investigation. They wondered why she seemed more interested in her likes and shares than in the progress of the ballistics report. One of the most disturbing aspects of this interim period was the role of the 5-year-old sister in Sarah's content. Occasionally, the toddler would appear in the background of Sarah's videos, a silent, wide-eyed ghost of the night of February 20th. Sarah would use the child as a prop for her narrative of the last two left. She would post videos of herself hugging the girl, captioned with phrases like, "I will protect you from the shadows that took them." To the public, it was heartwarming. To the investigators who knew the child had identified the shadow as Sarah herself, it was a psychological horror movie playing out in 15-second clips. The tension was also building between Sarah and her biological father, Charles Patrick. While she was publicly mourning the Brocks, her private communications, recovered much later, showed a girl who was already planning her new life. She spoke with Charles about moving to a new state, about changing her name, and about the inheritance she believed was coming her way. The grief she showed on TikTok was a firewall, a way to keep the public and the police at a distance while she waited for the probate courts to hand over the keys to the Brock estate. As the months turned into the summer of 2025, Sarah's performance began to grow more elaborate. She started reaching out to major true crime YouTubers and sleuths, offering exclusive interviews where she could tell her story. She was attempting to co-opt the very community that usually hunts killers. She wanted to be the victim who couldn't be questioned. But the Carroll County Sheriff's Office was moving at a different pace. They were waiting for the lab results from the microfiber mop she had used in that 90-minute gap. They were waiting for the geofencing data that showed her phone's exact movements on the night of the murders. The disappearance and search in this case wasn't about finding a body or a missing person. It was about the disappearance of a daughter's soul. It was a search for the moment Sarah Grace Patrick decided that the perfect life her mother and stepfather provided was a cage that needed to be dismantled with a .38 caliber handgun. By June 2025, the digital world was obsessed with Sarah's survival story, but the physical world was closing in. The ring light was starting to flicker. The neighbors began to report seeing Sarah at the mall, laughing and shopping, only to see her post a video an hour later from her bed of sorrow. The mask wasn't just slipping, it was rotting. The very platform she used to hide her guilt was the one that ultimately condemned her. Every video she posted was a piece of evidence, a record of her psychological state and her ability to manipulate an audience. The investigators realized that Sarah didn't kill her parents because she was broken or insane. She killed them because they were the only obstacles to a world where she could be the sole architect of her own reality. The TikTok morning was the final act of a girl who believed that if she could make enough people believe her lie, it would eventually become the truth. But in the quiet, sterile offices of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the data was finally speaking. The 90-minute gap, the scrubbed hallway, and the chilling testimony of a 5-year-old girl were about to bring the performance to a violent, final halt. The investigation into the deaths of James and Christine Brock didn't just happen in the labs or the interrogation rooms of the Carroll County Sheriff's Office. It happened in the cross-section of old-school ballistics and the cutting-edge science of medical telemetry. For months, Sarah Grace Patrick had played the role of the grief-stricken teenager, but while she was curating her TikTok feed, investigators were building a digital cage around her. The intruder theory had been dead on arrival for the detectives, but proving that a 16-year-old girl was capable of such cold-blooded precision required evidence that was beyond reproach. The first major breakthrough was the analysis of the LVAD, left ventricular assist device. In the world of true crime, we often look for DNA or fingerprints, but in 2025, the most reliable witness in the room was James Brock's mechanical heart. The LVAD is a sophisticated piece of machinery that logs every event: battery life, pump speed, and, most crucially, flow interruptions. When the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI technicians downloaded the data from the external controller, the timeline of the murder shifted from unknown to exact. At 3:14 a.m., the machine recorded a sudden, violent cessation of flow, a result of the massive trauma to James's chest. The device immediately triggered a high-priority alarm, a piercing chirp, designed to wake anyone in the house. This data point was the smoking gun. If the murder happened at 3:14 a.m. and Sarah's call to 911 didn't occur until 4:45 a.m., there was a 90-minute void that Sarah could not explain. In her initial statements, she claimed she was woken up by the shots and called the police immediately. The LVAD proved she was lying. With the timeline established, the search for the weapon took on a new urgency. Investigators knew that Sarah had been secretly meeting with her biological father, Charles Patrick. They began a deep dive into Charles's associates and found a distant relative who had recently reported a .38 caliber handgun missing from his glove box. When the relative provided the serial number, ballistics experts were able to match the rifling patterns on the bullets recovered from the Brock's mattress to that specific weapon. Sarah hadn't just found a gun, she had procured one through a back channel, showing a level of premeditation that shocked even the most cynical detectives. The digital forensic team then turned their attention to Sarah's smartphone. While her public social media was a shrine to her parents, her private vault apps, hidden behind a calculator icon, revealed the true Sarah. These apps contained thousands of deleted messages and search queries. The GBI used specialized software to recover her history from the weeks leading up to February 20th. The results were chilling. Sarah had searched for how to disable a home security alarm from the inside. Best place to shoot someone to make it instant. Will a 5-year-old remember what they see in the dark? Can police trace a gun if it's wiped with bleach? This was the blueprint the prosecution needed. It proved that Sarah didn't snap in a moment of teenage angst. She had conducted a feasibility study for her own parents' execution. The messages to her father, Charles, further detailed her motive. She wrote about wanting the freedom of the city and how James and Christine were suffocating her with their rules and his medical needs. She viewed the house as a prison and the LVAD as the warden's bell. But the most delicate part of the investigation involved Sarah's 5-year-old sister. The child was the only other living soul in the house that night. In a series of forensic interviews conducted by specialists trained in childhood trauma, the truth finally emerged in fragments. The girl described the shadow that came into her room. She told the interviewer that the shadow smelled like Sarah's perfume, a specific sweet vanilla scent that Sarah wore every day. The child also noted that the shadow didn't have a face because of the big black hood, but she recognized the voice that told her to go back to sleep. When the interviewer asked the child if she was scared of the shadow, she replied, "No, because the shadow was my sister." The social echo of these findings was explosive. When the news leaked that the LVAD data contradicted Sarah's story, the community of Carrollton, which had raised tens of thousands of dollars for her, felt a collective sense of betrayal. The church members who had brought her meals and prayed over her now looked back at her TikTok videos with a sense of nausea. They realized they had been watching a killer edit her grief in real time. The rumors of a shadowy intruder were replaced by the realization that the monster had been sitting in the front pew of the church all along. The final piece of the puzzle was the microfiber mop. During a secondary search of the home in July 2025, investigators found a hidden compartment in the garage containing a damp mop head and a bottle of high-strength bleach. DNA testing on the mop head revealed microscopic traces of James Brock's blood and fibers from the black hoodie Sarah had been wearing. The 90-minute gap was no longer a mystery. Sarah had spent that time scrubbing the hallway to remove any physical evidence of her movement between the rooms. She had prioritized cleaning the floor over calling for medical help for her parents. On July 12, 2025, the Carroll County Sheriff's Office moved in for the arrest. They didn't find the orphaned girl they had seen on TikTok. They found a teenager who was cold, defiant, and primarily concerned with whether the media would be present for her perp walk. As they handcuffed her, one investigator noted that she didn't ask about her sister or the status of the case. She simply asked, "Is Charles coming to get me?" In the interrogation room, the lead detective sat across from Sarah and played the 911 call, then showed her the LVAD data logs. He pointed to the 3:14 a.m. timestamp and asked, "What were you doing for an hour and a half, Sarah?" Sarah Grace Patrick didn't cry. She didn't deny it. She leaned back in her chair, a slight mocking smile touching her lips, and said, "I was making sure the job was finished." This admission, while not a full confession, was the final nail in the coffin. The investigation had successfully stripped away the filters, the hashtags, and the church girl persona. It revealed a girl who had turned her life into a horror movie, casting her parents as the villains and herself as the tragic hero. The investigation block of this case proved that while technology can be used to hide a crime, it can also be the very thing that speaks for the victims when they can no longer speak for themselves. The mechanical heart of James Brock had one final beat left in it, and it was the beat that finally caught his killer. The 2026 trial of Sarah Grace Patrick transformed the Carrollton courthouse into a battleground between digital performance and forensic truth. As the prosecution displayed the LVAD logs, the mechanical heart's final, desperate shriek at 3:14 a.m., the room fell into a suffocating silence. The 90-minute gap, once a void of speculation, was filled with the graphic reality of a 16-year-old mopping away her mother's life while the machine beeped in the dark. The defense leaned heavily on caregiver burnout and the psychological manipulation of her biological father, Charles Patrick. But the narrative of the perfect daughter was dead. The most haunting moment came when the surviving sister's testimony was played. Her small voice describing the shadow effectively sealed Sarah's fate. In August 2026, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Sarah was sentenced to life without parole. As she was led away, she looked not at the grieving family, but at the cameras, still seeking the gaze of an audience she will never see again. The Brock home is quiet now. The mechanical heart that once dictated the family's rhythm has been silenced, and the ring lights have been packed away. Sarah Grace Patrick sought a life without boundaries, a digital world where she was the only star in a curated tragedy. But the filters finally faded, leaving only the cold, heavy weight of a life sentence. As her sister grows up in a world without the shadow in the hallway, we are left with a haunting truth. Some masks are more dangerous than the face they hide. The feed has ended. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below. Fort Worth, Texas, 1993. A quiet apartment becomes the stage for a tragedy that would haunt the community for years. Stephen Robards, a fit 38-year-old father, collapses and dies unexpectedly. The diagnosis is simple: a sudden, tragic heart attack. For a year, 16-year-old Marie Robards plays the part of the grieving, perfect daughter, until the ghost of her father begins to whisper. This is a story of a chemical betrayal inspired by a stolen formula and the haunting lines of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in the winter of 1993, one must first look at the man who stood at the center of a world he believed was stable, secure, and filled with a quiet kind of love. Stephen Robards was, by all accounts, the quintessential suburban father, a man whose life was defined by the steady, rhythmic pulse of hard work and parental devotion. At 38 years old, he had built a life for himself in Fort Worth, Texas, that many would envy, not for its glamour, but for its reliability. He worked as a tax assessor, a job that required a meticulous eye and a calm temperament, qualities that bled into his role as a father. Stephen was a man of routines. He was the type of person who ensured the lawn was perfectly manicured, the bills were paid on time, and his daughter Marie had every opportunity to succeed. Marie Robards was the light of Stephen's life, his only child, a bright, beautiful, and exceptionally gifted girl who seemed to be the perfect reflection of his efforts. Growing up in the suburban sprawl of North Texas, Marie was more than just a good student. She was a star. At Eastern Hills High School, she was known for her sharp intellect, her participation in the choir, and her place in the honors program. To the outside world, the bond between Stephen and Marie was unbreakable. Following a difficult divorce from Marie's mother, Beth, several years earlier, Stephen had fought for and won primary custody of his daughter. It was a role he took with immense seriousness, perhaps even a touch of overcompensation, as he tried to fill the emotional void left by a fractured home. But beneath the surface of this perfect suburban life, a different narrative was being written in the mind of a 16-year-old girl. While Stephen saw their life in Fort Worth as a sanctuary, Marie increasingly viewed it as a cage. The divorce had not just split the family, it had created two competing worlds. In Texas, there was the world of Stephen, academic expectations, rules, structured evenings, and the mundane reality of a father who, despite his love, could be seen as stifling. In Florida, there was the world of her mother, Beth. To Marie, Florida represented a kind of vibrant, sun-drenched freedom that her life in Fort Worth lacked. Beth was the more spontaneous parent, the one who offered emotional intensity and a connection that Marie craved with a desperation that bordered on obsession. The distance between Texas and Florida was more than just miles. It was a psychological chasm that Marie couldn't seem to bridge. Throughout her early teens, Marie struggled with a profound sense of displacement. She was a mama's girl, trapped in a daddy's world. Stephen, ever the pragmatist, believed that stability was the greatest gift he could provide. He provided a safe home, a focused environment for her studies, and a future that looked bright and certain. He didn't realize that for Marie, his very presence was the obstacle standing between her and the life she imagined with her mother. She didn't want the tax assessor's stability. She wanted the chaotic, affectionate proximity of a woman who was half a continent away. As Marie entered her sophomore year, the internal friction began to manifest in quiet, invisible ways. She remained an honors student, her grades never wavering, but her interests began to veer toward the dark and the complex. She was a brilliant student of science, particularly chemistry, a subject that offered her a sense of control over the physical world. In the lab, she found a language for her frustrations, a way to manipulate elements to achieve a desired result. Her teachers saw a dedicated scholar. Her father saw a daughter destined for greatness. Neither could see that Marie was beginning to look at the world through a lens of cold, calculated logic. The social atmosphere of Fort Worth in the early 90s provided a backdrop of normalcy that made Marie's inner turmoil even harder to detect. It was an era of big hair, suburban malls, and the pressure to conform to the image of the successful American family. Marie played her part to perfection. She was the girl other parents pointed to as an example, articulate, talented, and seemingly well-adjusted. But the resentment toward her father was growing like a slow-acting poison in her own mind. She felt that as long as Stephen was alive, as long as he held the legal right to her presence, she would never be truly free to go to her mother. Stephen, meanwhile, continued to pour his energy into his daughter's future. He was immensely proud of her academic achievements, often boasting to colleagues about her intelligence and her potential. He viewed her interest in the sciences as a stepping stone to a prestigious career, never imagining that the tools of her education would become the instruments of his own end. Their relationship was characterized by a quiet harmony that hid a growing, jagged edge. He would cook for her, drive her to rehearsals, and support her ambitions, all while she sat across from him at the dinner table, smiling through a mask of growing contempt. This period of their lives was a masterclass in deception, not the kind of deception that involves loud arguments or rebellious outbursts, but the quiet, suffocating kind that exists within the heart of a perfect child. Marie wasn't a rebel in the traditional sense. She didn't sneak out or fail her classes. Instead, she retreated into a private world of fantasy and academic focus, where the lines between her schoolwork and her personal desires began to blur. She began to see her life as a drama, one where the characters were fixed in their roles, and only a radical change could rewrite the script. The biography of Marie Robards up to this point is not one of obvious trauma or abuse. It is a biography of a girl who had everything, but wanted the one thing she felt her father was denying her: a life without him. The halls of Eastern Hills High School were a labyrinth of adolescent noise, the clatter of lockers, and the heavy, lingering scent of floor wax and cafeteria steam. For Marie Robards, these corridors were not just a place of learning. They were the testing grounds for a mask she wore with terrifying precision. She was a girl who lived in the margins of her own brilliance, an honors student who excelled in the sciences while her heart drifted nearly 1,200 miles away to the humid, sun-drenched coast of Florida. To her peers and teachers, she was the model of suburban success, a quiet, focused student who seemed destined for the University of Texas. But inside, a dangerous fantasy was beginning to take root, fueled by a singular, obsessive desire to be reunited with her mother, Beth. The obsession with Florida was not merely a childhood whim. It was a psychological anchor that pulled Marie away from the life her father, Stephen, had built for her in Fort Worth. She viewed her father's apartment not as a home, but as a temporary station in a life she never asked for. Every rule Stephen enforced, every dinner they shared, and every academic goal he encouraged felt like another brick in a wall separating her from the freedom she believed awaited her in her mother's arms. This emotional displacement created a void that Marie began to fill with the cold, logical certainties of her chemistry class. The chemistry lab was a sanctuary of glass and steel, a place where the world could be broken down into its base elements and manipulated with the turn of a burner or the measured pour of a beaker. It was here, among the periodic tables and the smell of sulfur and ozone, that Marie's academic curiosity took a dark, utilitarian turn. She wasn't just studying for an A anymore. She was looking for a solution, a literal chemical solution to the problem of her father. During her lectures, she learned about the various compounds stored in the school's locked supply cabinets, noting which ones were colorless, which were odorless, and which could slip unnoticed into a home-cooked meal. The formula she eventually settled on was barium acetate. In the school's inventory, it was a white, crystalline solid, appearing as innocuous as sugar or salt to the untrained eye. To Marie, however, it was the key to her cage. She researched the compound with the meticulousness of a professional, discovering that it was highly soluble and, more importantly, that it could mimic the symptoms of a natural cardiac event. It was a poison that promised to leave no obvious trace, a silent assassin that would do her work for her and allow her to slip away to Florida without the messy fallout of a traditional crime. As her scientific plan materialized, her extracurricular life provided the thematic inspiration she needed to justify the act. Marie was heavily involved in the school's drama department, and that semester, the class was deep into the study of Shakespeare's Hamlet. The play is a masterpiece of poison, betrayal, and the restless ghosts of fathers, and for Marie, the parallels were inescapable. She spent her afternoons rehearsing lines about the foul and most unnatural murder, all while harboring her own unnatural secret. The literary world of Elsinore, with its schemes and its juice of cursed Hebanon poured into an ear, became the mirror in which she viewed her own life. She wasn't just a teenager in Texas, she was a tragic figure in a grand drama where the removal of a king was the only way for the princess to claim her destiny. The formula and the fantasy merged in the quiet moments of her school day. She would sit in the back of the classroom, her notebook open not to history notes, but to the logistical details of her plan. She considered the timing, the dosage, and the delivery method. She knew that Stephen's favorite meal was tacos, a dish where the heavy seasoning and varied textures could easily hide the slight grittiness of a dissolved chemical. The fantasy of Florida, of the sand under her feet and the absence of her father's expectations, was so vivid it felt more real than the desk she sat at or the voice of the teacher at the chalkboard. The act of theft was a moment of cold, adrenaline-fueled precision. During a period when the lab was unsupervised or the teacher's back was turned, Marie slipped into the storage area where the more hazardous chemicals were kept. Her hands didn't shake as she reached for the container of barium acetate. She didn't hesitate as she transferred a lethal amount into a small plastic baggie and tucked it deep into her school bag, hidden among her honors textbooks and her script for Hamlet. In that moment, the transition from student to predator was complete. She carried the weight of the poison through the hallways, past her friends, and out the front doors of the school, feeling a strange sense of empowerment. The psychological justification she built was an intricate structure of denial. She told herself, and would later tell investigators, that she didn't necessarily want to kill her father. She simply wanted to make him so ill that he could no longer care for her, forcing the state to send her back to her mother in Florida. It was the logic of a child who understood the how of chemistry but refused to acknowledge the what of mortality. She viewed the barium acetate not as an instrument of death, but as a travel permit. As she walked home that day, the chemical was a secret fire in her pocket, a promise that the life she hated was about to end, and the fantasy she craved was finally within her reach. She was ready to pour her own version of the Hebanon, and the stage was set for a dinner that would change everything. The evening of February 18, 1993, began with the kind of mundane suburban stillness that defines the life of the Texas middle class. In Fort Worth, the air carried a lingering winter chill, a damp, biting cold that settled into the pavement and made the windows of the Robards' apartment sweat with condensation. Inside, the kitchen was bathed in the warm, artificial glow of overhead fluorescent lights, casting long, sharp shadows across the linoleum floor. Marie Robards, a 16-year-old with a mind as sharp as a scalpel, stood at the counter, moving with a calm, rhythmic precision that would have looked like typical teenage domesticity to any casual observer. She was preparing dinner, a simple meal of tacos, a favorite of her father's. But on this night, the seasoning would include something far more potent than cumin or chili powder. Earlier that afternoon, Marie had walked the halls of Eastern Hills High School with a secret tucked deep inside her backpack, nestled between her honors chemistry notes and her well-worn copy of Shakespeare's Hamlet. She had spent weeks studying the properties of barium acetate, a chemical she had carefully extracted from the school's supply room, a white, crystalline powder that looked almost identical to the salt she now sprinkled over the sizzling ground beef. In her mind, the lines of the play she was studying for drama class looped like a haunting soundtrack, the juice of cursed Hebanon being poured into a king's ear, a foul and most unnatural murder. But Marie didn't see herself as a villain. She saw herself as a director, someone finally taking control of a script she had hated for too long. The sizzle of the meat filled the small kitchen, a sound so ordinary it felt like a shield against the gravity of what was happening. Marie stirred the skillet, the steam rising to dampen her face, her eyes fixed on the darkening hue of the beef. When the time came, she reached for the small plastic baggie. Her hands were steady. There was no cinematic tremble, no second guessing. She measured out the barium acetate, a lethal dose, calculated with the cold efficiency of an honors student, and stirred it into the mixture. The compound was odorless and colorless once dissolved, a phantom element that vanished into the heavy, spicy aroma of the taco seasoning. She plated the food, setting the table with a meticulousness that felt like a ritual, waiting for the sound of her father's key in the lock. Stephen Robards arrived home around 6 p.m., exhausted from a long day as a tax assessor, but visibly pleased to find his daughter had prepared a hot meal. He was a man who lived for these small moments of connection, a father who viewed his quiet life with Marie as his greatest achievement after the wreckage of his divorce. He told her about the mundane stresses of his day, the paperwork and the city politics, while Marie listened, or appeared to. She watched him take the first bite, then the second. She watched the man who had raised her, who had fought for her, unknowingly consume the very thing that would stop his heart. There was a surreal quality to the dinner, a teenage girl and her father, sharing a meal in a quiet apartment, while a silent chemical timer began to tick toward zero. The first signs of the poison's work appeared almost immediately after the meal was finished. Stephen began to complain of a strange, tightening sensation in his chest and a sudden, overwhelming wave of nausea. He initially dismissed it as a simple case of food poisoning or perhaps a touch of the flu that had been circulating through the office. But the progression was too rapid, too violent to be anything ordinary. Within the hour, He was doubled over in the bathroom, his body racked by severe vomiting and abdominal pain. Marie stood in the hallway, the cool air of the apartment pressing against her skin, watching the father she supposedly loved descend into a physical agony she had personally orchestrated. As the barium acetate began to wreak havoc on Stephen's system, blocking the potassium channels in his cells and leading to a rapid, life-threatening drop in his blood potassium levels, his muscles began to fail. He told Marie that his legs felt heavy, like lead, and that a strange tingling was spreading through his fingertips and toes. He was losing his ability to stand, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that echoed off the tiled walls of the bathroom. It was a terrifying, paralyzed descent, a body shutting down while the mind remained fully aware of the encroaching darkness. Marie didn't rush to the phone. She didn't scream for the neighbors. Instead, she played the part of the concerned but helpless daughter, asking him what she should do, her voice a practiced mask of adolescent panic. By the time Marie finally dialed 911, the situation had reached a critical mass. The dispatcher heard a girl's voice, high-pitched and frantic, reporting that her father had collapsed and was struggling to breathe. It was a performance that would hold up for over a year, a masterpiece of deception. When the paramedics arrived at the apartment, the scene was one of domestic chaos. They found Stephen lying on the floor, his skin a sickly, ashen gray, his heart racing in a desperate, erratic rhythm as it struggled to pump blood through a failing system. Marie stood in the corner, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with what everyone assumed was traumatic shock. The walk from the apartment to the ambulance was a blur of flashing red and blue lights, the sirens wailing against the quiet Fort Worth night. Stephen was still conscious, though barely, his eyes searching for his daughter in the chaos. The paramedics worked feverishly, administering oxygen and starting IV lines, but they were fighting an invisible enemy they didn't yet understand. In the emergency room at Osteopathic Medical Center, the staff saw a 38-year-old man in the throes of a massive, unexplained cardiac event. They checked his vitals, ran blood work, and performed CPR as his heart began to falter. But the chemical betrayal was too thorough. Barium poisoning is rare, and its symptoms, vomiting, paralysis, and heart failure, mirror so many other natural pathologies that no one thought to look for a high school chemistry experiment. At 11:45 p.m., the monitors in the trauma room emitted a single, flat, continuous tone. Stephen Robards was pronounced dead. The cause of death was officially listed as a heart attack, a tragic, sudden end for a man in the prime of his life. In the waiting room, Marie received the news with a grief that seemed entirely genuine to the doctors and the relatives who soon arrived to comfort her. She wept for the father she had just killed, her tears a final, brilliant act in the tragedy she had written. The apartment in Fort Worth was now empty of its king, and as the grieving daughter prepared to leave the state, she felt a cold, simmering sense of relief. The formula had worked. The fantasy of Florida was finally within her reach, and for a year, the secret of what really happened on that cold February night would remain buried as deep as her father. The burial of Stephen Robards was a somber, gray affair, a gathering of grieving relatives and confused colleagues who simply could not reconcile the image of the healthy, 38-year-old man with the reality of the wooden box being lowered into the Texas soil. Marie was the undisputed centerpiece of this tragedy, a figure of profound adolescent loss who clung to her mother, Beth, with a desperation that every observer found heartbreakingly appropriate. No one noticed the cold, calculating relief behind her black veil, or the way she already seemed to be looking past the graveyard, across the state lines toward the coast of Florida. For Marie, the funeral was not a goodbye to a father, but the successful closing of a chapter she had written in the margins of her chemistry textbooks. Following the interment, the legal and social hurdles that had once kept Marie anchored to the suburban landscape of Fort Worth dissolved as if they had never existed. With Stephen gone, custody was no longer a matter of judicial decree or bitter negotiation. It was a settled reality. Within weeks, the quiet apartment was packed into boxes, the memories of her father's meticulously timed routines were discarded, and Marie began the 1,100-mile journey toward the life she had hallucinated during those long nights in North Texas. The move to Florida was supposed to be the final act of her transformation. The moment when the hamlet of Eastern Hills High School could finally step off the stage and live in the perpetual sun she believed she had earned. Initially, the reality of life in Florida seemed to match her dark fantasy. She moved into her mother's home, a transition that offered the emotional spontaneity and the physical proximity she had craved since the divorce. She was no longer under the thumb of Stephen's expectations, his tax assessor's logic, or his persistent, well-meaning questions about her homework. The air was thick with the scent of salt, and the temperatures regularly climbed into the 90s, a humid, vibrant contrast to the sterile environment of her father's home. She enrolled in a new high school, quickly establishing herself as a bright, if somewhat distant student, and began to build a persona that was entirely detached from the girl who had seasoned a skillet of ground beef with a stolen chemical. But a year is a long time for a secret to stay buried, especially one that carries the physical and spiritual weight of a human life. As the first anniversary of Stephen's death approached in February 1994, the facade Marie had built began to show its first microscopic cracks. The ghost of her father, much like the king in the play she had studied with such morbid intensity, did not stay quietly in the ground. Marie began to suffer from persistent insomnia, her nights filled with the vivid, terrifying memory of the sounds her father had made in the bathroom while the barium acetate shut down his nervous system. The perfect life in Florida was being corroded from the inside, poisoned by the very act that had secured its existence. She became increasingly erratic in her social interactions, her academic brilliance replaced by a brooding, distracted intensity that worried her new acquaintances. Her friends noticed that she would often stare into the distance for minutes at a time, or react with disproportionate, jagged emotion to the simplest mentions of family or grief. It was during this period of psychological fraying that she grew close to a classmate named Stacy High. Stacy was everything Marie used to be, cheerful, stable, and deeply empathetic. And perhaps it was that very empathy that made her a dangerous confidant. Marie saw in Stacy a vessel for her own guilt, a way to finally purge the Hebanon that was now pouring into her own troubled soul. The tipping point arrived in the spring of 1994, over a year after the crime, during a quiet sleepover at Stacy's house. The two teenagers were in the basement, the room dimly lit by the flickering glow of a television and the pale moonlight filtering through a high, narrow window. The atmosphere was intimate, the kind of safe, enclosed space where the most dangerous secrets feel lighter than they do in the daylight. They had been talking for hours about their futures and the pressures of being young when the conversation drifted, as it almost always did when Marie was involved, toward the subject of her father's sudden, tragic passing. Marie began to weep, but it was not the practiced, theatrical grief she had displayed at the funeral in Fort Worth. This was a raw, jagged unraveling of a mind that could no longer contain its own history. In low, trembling tones, she admitted to Stacy that the world didn't understand what had really happened in that apartment. She confessed that the heart attack everyone spoke of was a carefully constructed lie, a lie she had created with a stolen baggie of chemicals and a home-cooked meal. Stacy sat in the deep shadows, her breath hitching as Marie detailed the cold, clinical logic of the murder. She described how she had slipped the barium acetate into the tacos, how she had watched him eat, and how she had stood in the hallway, listening to him die in agony. The confession was a tidal wave of terrifying detail. Marie explained that her motive had been entirely selfish. She simply couldn't endure another day of her father's rules, and he was the only physical obstacle standing between her and her mother's house. She described the symptoms of the barium poisoning with a detached, scientific accuracy that chilled Stacy to the bone, noting the creeping paralysis and the way his heart had eventually given up. She admitted that she had wanted him gone to secure her own freedom, but now that he was dead, she couldn't stop seeing his face in her dreams. The play she had rehearsed in high school had become her permanent reality, and the guilt was a phantom she could no longer outrun. For Stacy, the revelation was a psychological burden she was never meant to carry. She listened as her best friend described the premeditated destruction of a man who had adored her, realizing with a mounting horror that the girl sitting across from her was a stranger, a killer who had successfully manipulated an entire community, a police department, and a medical examiner. Marie begged Stacy to keep the secret, telling her that if the truth ever surfaced, her new life in Florida would be destroyed, and her mother would never look at her the outside again. She pleaded for Stacy's silence, unaware that the weight of the confession was already beginning to crush the very friendship that had inspired it. The night ended in a heavy, suffocating silence, the two girls lying in the darkness, one briefly relieved by the purge, and the other haunted by a truth she could never unhear. The silence that followed Marie's confession in that Florida basement did not bring the peace she had hoped for. Instead, it acted as a slow-release toxin, working its way through the conscience of the only person who now shared her burden. Stacy High spent the weeks following the sleepover in a state of quiet, vibrating terror. Every time she looked at Marie, she no longer saw the grieving daughter or the brilliant student. She saw the cold, calculated movement of a girl who had watched her father die for the sake of a beach in Florida. The weight was physically unbearable. Stacy found herself unable to focus in class, the scent of the school's floor wax and the mundane chatter of her peers feeling like an insult to the secret she carried. She stopped eating. Her sleep was haunted by the image of a man she had never met gasping for air in a Texas bathroom, and finally, the pressure reached a breaking point. In the late spring of 1994, Stacy finally sat down with her mother. The conversation was jagged, filled with the kind of hesitations and stammers that precede a world-altering truth. When the words finally came out, when she recounted the story of the stolen barium acetate and the poisoned tacos, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Stacy's mother, realizing the gravity of what she had just heard, didn't hesitate. She contacted the school counselor, who in turn reached out to the local authorities. The secret that had traveled 1,200 miles from Fort Worth was finally being handed back to the people who could do something about it. The initial report landed on the desk of the Fort Worth Police Department like a piece of dark fiction. It had been over a year since Stephen Robards had been buried. The case was closed, the death certificate signed and filed under natural causes cardiac arrest. To the detectives in Texas, the tip from Florida sounded like the hysterical imaginings of a teenager or a plot point from a movie. Why would an honors student, a girl with no history of violence or rebellion, kill the father who had provided her with everything? But the details Stacy provided were too specific to ignore. She mentioned the chemical by name, barium acetate, a compound so obscure that a typical teenager wouldn't even know it existed, let alone its specific physiological effects. Sergeant Danny Nuttall and the investigators at the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's office began the painstaking process of looking backward. They pulled the original file on Stephen Robards, searching for anything they might have missed in the frantic hours of his death. The original toxicology report was clean, but that was the problem. Standard toxicology screens in 1993 were designed to catch common drugs of abuse, alcohol, or well-known poisons like arsenic or cyanide. Barium was not on the list. It was an invisible killer, a substance that leaves the body quickly and mimics the symptoms of a natural heart attack so perfectly that it had bypassed the most basic defenses of the medical system. The pivot in the investigation came when the police realized that to prove a crime had been committed, they would have to perform the most grisly task of all. They had to bring Stephen Robards back from the ground. The exhumation was scheduled for a humid Texas morning, the kind where the fog clings to the tombstones like a wet shroud. The sound of the backhoe breaking the earth was a rhythmic, violent intrusion into the quiet of the cemetery. Detectives stood by in silence, the air heavy with the metallic scent of damp soil and the mechanical hum of the machinery. They were looking for a ghost, a physical remnant of a betrayal that had been buried for 15 months. When the casket was finally raised and opened in the sterile, brightly lit environment of the morgue, the investigators were met with a stroke of grim luck. Because of the specific embalming process and the way the body had been preserved, Stephen's tissues were still viable for testing. The medical examiners didn't just need to find barium, they needed to find it in concentrations that ruled out environmental exposure. They focused on the hair, the liver, and the heart tissue, the places where the juice of cursed Hebanon would have left its mark. The lab work was a marathon of high-stakes science. The technicians used atomic absorption spectroscopy, a process that involves vaporizing samples to detect specific metallic elements. For days, the machines hummed in the background of the lab, a sterile, high-frequency sound that felt like a countdown. When the results finally flickered across the computer screens, the room went cold. The levels of barium in Stephen Robard's system were staggering, hundreds of times higher than what could be considered normal. The natural heart attack had been a chemical execution. The science had finally caught up to the story Marie had told in the dark of a Florida basement. While the scientists worked on the how, the detectives shifted their focus to the where. They descended upon Eastern Hills High School, moving through the halls that Marie had walked a year earlier. They interviewed the chemistry teachers, their questions cutting through the nostalgia of the school year. The breakthrough happened in the supply room. A review of the old inventory logs, the paper trails that Marie thought no one would ever check, showed a discrepancy. A container of barium acetate had been noted as missing or depleted around the same time Stephen had died. The teachers remembered Marie as the star student, the girl who had unfettered access to the lab, the girl who was always asking questions that seemed to go beyond the curriculum. The social echo of the investigation began to ripple through Fort Worth. Rumors of the exhumation spread like wildfire through the suburban neighborhoods. The image of the perfect Robard's family was being dismantled in the public eye. People who had comforted Marie at the funeral now felt a cold shiver of realization. They remembered her tears, her black dress, and the way she had clung to her mother, and they realized they had been witnesses to a masterclass in sociopathic performance. The community was no longer mourning a tragic death. They were watching the emergence of a teenage predator. As the detectives gathered the last pieces of the puzzle, the school records, the lab results, and the haunting testimony from Stacy High, they realized they had enough for an arrest. The investigation had moved from a skeptical phone call to a scientific certainty. They had the formula, they had the motive, and they had the physical evidence of the poison in the man's very bones. The girl who had tried to rewrite her life with a chemical solution was about to find out that the truth, much like the barium she had used, is nearly impossible to keep hidden forever. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a transition from the quiet suburbs to the cold reality of a Texas courtroom. In 1995, the Tarrant County courtroom was transformed into the final act of a tragedy Marie Robards could no longer control. She sat at the defense table, her appearance, a simple white blouse and modest hair, deliberately styled to mirror the innocent honors student the world once admired. But the prosecution was relentless. They presented the physical evidence of the stolen barium acetate and the academic records that proved she understood exactly what the chemical would do to a human heart. The defense attempted a desperate pivot, arguing that Marie was merely a confused child who never intended to kill, only to make Stephen ill enough to force a change in custody. It was a plea for mercy based on a tragic mistake, but the jury refused to buy the script. They focused on the hours of calculated silence as she watched her father die. In a verdict that cut through the suburban quiet of Fort Worth, Marie was found guilty of murder. The judge's voice was cold as he delivered a 27-year sentence, a definitive, crushing end to the Florida fantasy she had killed to achieve. She would eventually be released on parole in 2003 after serving only 7 years, leaving behind a legacy of chemical betrayal that remains one of Texas's most chilling domestic crimes. The story of Marie Robards remains a dark footnote in Texas history, a reminder that the most dangerous toxins are often brewed in the quietest hearts. Today, the suburban streets of Fort Worth have moved on, but the name of Stephen Robards is forever linked to a chemical betrayal that defied nature. Marie vanished into anonymity after her 2003 release, leaving behind a ghost that Shakespeare would have recognized, a king dead for a daughter's fantasy of a son that never truly warmed her. The case is closed, but the shadow of the Hamlet poisoner still lingers in the halls of Eastern Hills. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.